Hi, I'm Ben.
And I'm Josh.
And this is the Bad at Magic Podcast, a podcast about games, life, and other things. And welcome to episode 90.
Ooh, Ben, we're getting up there, man.
I know, right?
90's a lot. Like, all these episodes that end in 0, that's a big deal. Multiples of 5, for some reason, are a big deal to people.
Okay,
now,
well, what's significant about this one?
Oh, there's lots of things that are significant about 90, but I found one that I thought was really interesting. And so, Ben, are you aware that baseball fields, professional baseball fields I'm talking about, are not standardized?
Yeah, and how weird is that? I mean, can you imagine if you played basketball and like the hoop was a different height depending on whose stadium you were in or something like that? Like every other sports game, everything is standardized to the millimeter.
Yeah. Oh, here in Los Angeles, we've got better players, so we put our hoops at 11.6. But, down in Detroit where it's a little, we have them down at like 6'4". Just to make things...
any sport.
Yeah,
Football, bowling, ping pong, everything's measured out to the exact specifications. Why is baseball the only sport where, it's not?
Well, so they do actually have exact specifications in baseball for the infield. The baselines are always going to be exactly 90 feet from base to base. The distance from home plate to second plate is clearly defined, so you don't get wonky diamonds that are squished or whatever. The distance from home plate to the pitcher's mound or the rubber on the pitcher's mound is set. The height of the pitcher's mound is uniform. The only thing that's not uniform is the outfield.
Okay.
Distances, the heights of the walls, all of that is kind of up for grabs. And I found 2 reasons for this. One of those is historical. And the idea that these stadiums were built, throughout all of time, all of different baseball rules and how good baseball players were. And geographic location wise, you have ballparks that are in downtown metropolitan areas don't have enough space to have stands in the outfield. And so their walls are super high. And whereas newer stadiums that are built out in the middle of no place have all the space in the world and they want to have a lot of seats for people to sit, they tend to make those as big as they can get away with. So they have more room, more surface area around the field to actually seat people.
Yeah, I was on a TDY to Boston once, and I went and caught a game in the afternoon at Fenway Park in Boston, and I sat on top of the Green Monster, and you got the freeway right behind you, and then there's 3 rows of, a dozen rows of seats right at the end of the outfield.
Right. Well, one cool thing, we'll put a link in the show notes. I found this great this data. I know you like visual data, and it has this website that the first thing that's on it is this GIF. And it's GIF. I don't want to hear any guff from you. That takes a baseball diamond and it draws the shape of every Major League Baseball stadium around it, in real time, so you can see the differences.
I like it.
And you scroll down a little bit. It does the same thing for the outfield fences. And then you keep scrolling and it shows a couple of the really weird outliers as far as these are some of the weirdest stadiums and why they are that way. But of all of the stuff that we're talking about not being standardized, the baselines are standardized, and they are 90 feet apart.
Okay, episode 90. Man, I want to talk about baseball for a bit more, though. One of the things that blows my mind about this is the way we keep statistics. We talk about how many home runs a player's hit, but there's some home stadiums where the distance from the plate to the outfield wall is shorter than any other. There should be...
So you say players should have, at this field, a player should get 1.1 home runs if they actually hit a home run versus this field where it's 0.9 of a home run.
Right, but we just it's too complicated to do that. So we just track it like it's 1 for 1. But any player that plays their whole career in the stadium where it's easiest to hit home runs has a handicap when it comes to hitting home runs.
Well, now hang on a second. Maybe we're oversimplifying because if players... I'm thinking statistically now, if you played in every stadium an equal amount, then it just averages out. Then you don't even have to worry about it. Is that the case, though?
You play more home games than away games. So if you had you were at the stadium that had the easiest place to hit home runs, you would have a slight handicap when it came to hitting home runs.
I don't know enough about baseball to challenge you on how much or how often people play where.
Well, you play more at home than you do any other individual park.
Is that true? I mean, it's got to be true, right? Well,
yes.
How could that be true, though? If, everybody plays the same number of games, then wouldn't, if everybody played more games at home than they play away, and everybody plays the same number of games...
Okay, let's say it's half and half, but for half it's one stadium, and then for the other half...
It's just not
all the other stadiums.
Okay, all right, now, that clicks. I'm okay with that.
Okay. All right.
Talk baseball all you want, and I'll sit back here and ponder the math for you.
All right, Josh. So there's something going on in the news right now that kind of relates to something we've talked about on the podcast, and that is that there is this uprising amongst other nerds. I guess you consider yourself part of this group. I don't, but it is Dungeons and Dragons players. So what's for the layperson? What is going on with Dungeons and Dragons licensing right now?
Oh, Ben. So, all right. So this is a really cool intersection of like internet community and corporate law and monetization of intellectual property. Like, there's a lot of cool things that are happening with this, and this is why I'm not up on it. Like, I'm not like live tweeting about it or anything like that, but I'm keeping my eye on it because it is just an interesting development on this whole thing.
Yeah.
And so what's going on is Dungeons and Dragons is an intellectual property. It's a tabletop role-playing game that is owned by Wizards of the Coast, who notably also manufacture Magic the Gathering. The thing that we talk about occasionally on our podcast called
and both of those are owned by Hasbro Corporation that also makes like Monopoly and Jenga.
We'll talk about Hasbro in a bit, but
okay.
For now, this intellectual property, Dungeons and Dragons, is owned by Wizards of the Coast. Okay, and back in 2000, in the long ago, in the before times, they released what they called their OGL, the Open Gaming License, and it's 1.0 Alpha is the one that was published in 2000. What this is. It was Wizards of the Coast basically announcing to the world in a legal document, hey, if you want to play our game, if you want to live stream our game, if you want to make a podcast about our game or generate content for our game or use your game in your venture to do things and monetize it, go nuts. It's all you. Like, they put out like the core rules, and they said like the core rule gaming system, sitting down and rolling dice and how the stats work, like the actual mechanics of the game, that's all fair game. Like, do whatever you want with it.
That was forward thinking of them because podcasting and live streaming didn't exist in 2000.
Well, the idea was, I feel like it was just any press is good press, right? Like, hey, if people are going to be out there and passionate about our game, and if they want to put out content about it, that's just going to get more exposure for us.
Right.
Now, the license does specify like their specific intellectual properties, like character names and like actual things that they created inside of the mechanics itself. That's still protected. Like, that's still property of the company. So you can't like reproduce like word for word like their adventure modules or stuff like that.
Rattle off some proper nouns if you can.
Minsk and Boo is
Minsk and Boo. Beholders.
Yeah, the monsters, stuff like that. Illithids? I think illithids, like mind flayers. There you go. Stuff like that. You can't reproduce those.
Dire wolf.
Now, notably, this is a real quick tangent. I know you don't care, but this is a deep cut. The 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons was very different from other versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of people didn't like it. So many people didn't like it. In fact, there was one group of people that split off and created a separate company called Paizo that took the old Dungeons and Dragons rules and like refined it and made it a little more complicated under this open gaming license and put out an entirely new game called Pathfinder that was an alternate like choice from Dungeons and Dragons during the 4th edition era.
Josh, I could take that phrase you just said and replace a few proper nouns, and you've described like Protestantism.
I've described every like group of like, oh, we like the old way better, and they split off and kept the old way while the new way progressed.
I'm talking about like actual religious factions breaking off and going back to the old rules.
Ben, there are people that did that with Coke and Coke Zero. Like, it's not just religion; it's everything that has ever changed.
Sure.
There are always going to be a group of people that break off and like, no, we're going to stick with the old stuff because we hate change.
I don't know. I've never seen anyone be like, you know what? We need to go back to the old style mulligans in Magic.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, back on topic. Here's what's interesting about the Open Gaming License. The one that was published, 1.0A, that was published in 2000, had this section in it, Section 9, and this is what the whole hubbub is about. I'm going to read this verbatim, and you tell me how this is unlike any legal document you've ever heard, okay?
Okay, go ahead.
Wizards or its designated agents may publish updated versions of this license. You may use any authorized version of this license to copy, modify, and distribute any open game content originally distributed under any version of this license.
Wow, that's a lot of any's and you mays.
That's the point. That clause basically says that, hey, go ahead, you are protected. It doesn't matter if we change it down the line. You can use any published version of this license and it is still valid in perpetuity.
Okay, there's a part of this I'm not understanding. What does the phrase open game mean? Is it talking about the playing of it or the content itself?
So specifically, the phrase open game content is all capitalized, and that is referring to the stuff that is included in the license. What I mentioned earlier, the actual mechanics of the game, like the rolling of the dice, how numbers compare to each other, how you create a character, how you have an adventure, how you attack another NPC or a monster and how it attacks you back. All of that stuff is part of the core mechanics. How the game actually works is protected by this license.
Okay.
Again,
wow.
It's the proper.
So this is really liberal, and like you said, it was maybe a fortuitous, forward-thinking way of promoting the game in that time period.
Yes, back in 2000. Like, it really felt like people that cared about the game. Like, the Wizards of the Coast, notoriously, before it was purchased by Hasbro, was a company made of gamers trying to make games that they loved. And they just wanted their stuff out in the world for people to enjoy, and this is a direct legal reflection of that.
Okay.
So here's what happened, is then Wizards CEO came out a few weeks ago, or actually it was a couple months ago now, and was on the record as saying that they felt that Dungeons & Dragons as a game was under-monetized. And that put everybody's like ears perked forward like, I'm sorry, what now? Because for like the longest time, you're not monetizing this game, not like the extra content. There are whole businesses built on this. There's Critical Role. You've heard of Critical Role. You have nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. Critical Role is professional voice actors that play Dungeons & Dragons together, and they put out their gaming sessions on a podcast and on YouTube and everywhere. And they make like over 10...
It's so popular that they have like miniatures of the characters that they do in this game.
They have a show on Amazon Prime, an animated Dungeons & Dragons show that is the Critical Role campaigns that they play. And they make over $10 million a year, these people, and they're playing Dungeons & Dragons. That is not, they don't own that.
I could see how Wizards of the Coast is sitting around in a boardroom saying, we need to get some more of that money.
That's what I'm saying. And like in this discussion with the CEO talking about monetization, she mentioned stuff like the way that microtransactions happen in video games. Like, oh, there's ways that we can keep the game free, but then just, take nibbles at the edges or whatever and just, somewhat recoup some of that. Why is everybody making money on stuff that I made? That's not fair. Now, again, that's the transition, though. 2000, we had people like, hey, play our game and enjoy it. Those are the gamers. Now we have this one's like, oh, play our game, but we're going to want a piece of that. That's the boardroom. And so after that was said, they came out with a draft new version of the Open Gaming License, version 1.1. It's still draft. It's not official yet. Notably, here's the things that they did. 1, Section 9 was repealed. It's not in this new one. Like, they don't have it in there anymore. And 2, here are just some of the bullet points that they made the changes of.
Okay.
Wizards is owed 25% royalty on revenue from any open game license creator earning over $750,000 a year. The right for Wizards to use any content created under the license for any purpose. And a seeming ban on virtual tabletop simulators. So that's like, if you've ever heard of Roll20, or there are people out there that have created software where you can sit down online virtually and have like almost a Zoom call, but one of the screens is just like a board with your D&D characters on it, and you can play Dungeons & Dragons completely virtually.
Yes. It's interesting that they are setting a floor on this. If you don't rise above the floor, then you're just noise. We're letting you get away with it. Because if they wrote this as like anybody making money off of our game has to give us some of it, they're setting up basically an impossible to enforce situation. Well,
and this is actually a pretty common thing that has happened. There was a Supreme Court case a few years ago. It was Wayfair versus some state. And the idea was that this state sued Wayfair, which is an online furniture retailer, because that retailer wasn't paying state sales tax for sales into that state. Because they're like, we're online, we're not in your state, we don't fall under your sales tax. Well, Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state, and they set basically now state legislators are allowed to set what they call economic nexus, and every state has a different one. Arizona's is particularly high, California's is particularly low, but it's different for everybody. Even if you're a business that is outside of this state, if you make sales over this threshold into this state, you owe state sales tax on those sales, period, dot, end of discussion. I don't care what you sold or who you sold it to. So this is kind of the same thing, is Like you said, everybody below this threshold is not worth going after. Like Wizards is not going to spend the time or the man hours for a lawyer to track down a podcast like us talking about Dungeons and Dragons. But I can absolutely see Critical Role getting a letter to be like, hey, you make $10 million a year off of crap you don't own.
Interesting. Okay. Now, I think the common element between those two examples you gave, which kind of sound unrelated but really are, is that the internet has transformed the way people make money. You know, you can have people that can have a podcast or a YouTube channel or a Twitch stream or whatever, and they can make a significant amount of money off of something that before just wasn't possible. And so at the time that Section 9 of the OGL 1.0a was written, this wasn't even a twinkle in someone's eye. They couldn't even imagine a world where this kind of situation exists. So now the ground has shifted under their feet, and they're like, well, we still have the same game, and we still have this same open license out here, but the world has changed so much that maybe we should think about rewriting this.
Well, and now this is where I'm going to bring Hasbro back into the conversation. Between then and now, Wizards of the Coast was acquired by Hasbro, a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy for its board games because Monopoly's terrible. Stop playing Monopoly, people. Like Kickstarter for real has taken over the entire board game market. Like just that. I'm not even going to get into that. That's a whole other thing. But Hasbro put on Wizards like years and years ago, you need to double your revenue in the next like 3 years. And Wizards did it in like less than 2 years by ramping up the production on Magic the Gathering. And we've talked about this before, the amount of products that are coming out, the pace at which they are coming out. Like Wizards like just took the dial of Magic the Gathering and cranked it to 11, and it's just like it turned into a money pinata, and they're just smacking it, and money keeps falling out of you and I's pockets because more Magic, more better.
Yeah, so I'd like to think they've also expanded their market a bit, but yes.
Well, it's all of these things, right? It's a corporate motivation for like, hey, we need to monetize. Well, sure. Now, flash forward to today. Wizards of the Coast makes up 70% of Hasbro's income. Wow. And Hasbro has challenged them again. You need to increase your revenues by 50% in the next 3 years. And then a couple weeks later, we have Wizards CEO coming out saying, we think our other major intellectual property is under-monetized. Those are related.
Yeah, that just kind of strikes me as wrong. I mean, to go back to baseball, let's say you have one player on the team that's scoring 70% of your points. At what point is he the one calling the shots? Instead of being bossed around.
That's not
told
how
he needs to ramp up production even more.
That's not how corporate America works, Ben. Like the CEO of Wizards of the Coast.
Baseball teams are corporations.
No. Yeah, but the pitcher can't flip off the owner and say, "What are you going to do? Fire me?" Because the owner very, very well could.
Yeah, but if it's a big enough player, if they were making 70% of the points, the owner couldn't fire them.
Yes, no, but we're not talking about firing Wizards. We're talking about firing people at Wizards. It's like if the CEO of Wizards doesn't want to play with its corporate overlords, the corporate overlord's just going to replace them.
Okay, so all aside about whether or not it was wise for the CEO of Wizards to say this and kind of raise up the gaming community against him, do you think there's any legitimacy to what they're doing? Was it time for the open game license to change?
So, what we haven't talked about is the lighting of torches and the massing of pitchforks that happened when the draft OGL came out, and when because again, there are now multi-million-dollar businesses that are run on this open gaming license that legally says you can't ever retract it. So how are you going to try to retract it or start take backsies now? You know what I mean? I've built my entire company on the idea that you are putting this out into the world for free and said you would do it forever, cross your heart, hope to die. And now you're going to come at me? So yeah, there are Paizo, that company that created Pathfinder, and like just every content creator that's associated with Dungeons & Dragons, a ton of players of Dungeons & Dragons, like they just blew up the internet with this shall not stand. And to their credit, Wizards has backed off on a lot of this. Like Section 9 has come back. There are still some negotiations about the income thresholds that we're talking about. But one of the major sticking points that Wizards is using to try to make themselves not look like such greedy corporate punks, they're saying is like, well, we just need more control over the community in case anybody starts publishing hurtful or hate speech or, like discriminatory things with our intellectual property, we need to be able to control some of that to make sure that we're not associated with those people.
We just need the legal authority to be able to be woke. Okay, nice try, corporate overlords.
Well, that's the only thing that they could possibly spin this. That wasn't, well, we own it and we want to make more money.
Yeah. Well, I think that cat's already out of the bag. But I also think there probably is some justification. The world has changed enough that however good or whatever reason the old version was sufficient, it's not anymore. It probably should change.
I don't know. I don't know. This just, like I said, I don't want to make any good or bad, like no moral distinction on this, but between the lawful and chaotic spectrum, I'll talk about that. The motivation behind this change is clearly one of corporate monetization. There is no other reason that you would want to take back control and specifically revenue generated by your property in this way for any other reason besides you just want the money. The old Wizards of the Coast just loved the game and they wanted people to play it. And now the new Wizards of the Coast is under the lash of their corporate overlords and they have to make money somehow.
Yeah, I won't argue with that. I think that is something to be mourned and lamented. And I'd also like to think that at the heart of this company, there are still people that aren't just, mass-produced moneymakers. They're still gamers at heart. They still love gaming.
We keep saying that. And like every time something bad in Magic happens, they bring Mark Rosewater and they put him in front of a microphone because he's a nerd's nerd. And like you can't even listen to him for 5 minutes without being like, oh, this is one of our people.
Right.
But at the same time, like, all evidence points otherwise. Like this is 100% like a corporate machine now that's trying to monetize something that we grew up loving because when we were growing up with it wasn't monetized. It wasn't monetized as heavily and it was built by people that love the game. And yeah, like how long is the excuse like, well, there's still some people that love the game in there. Like, I mean, I'm sure that that's true, but at what point is that overridden by the corporate, like the corporateness of it?
I can't even think. So you gave the example of Critical Role. I can't even think of an example before the year 2000 of something like this. Maybe there is, and I'm just not creative enough. But the internet has allowed this to happen. It didn't exist before. It wasn't possible to just grow from obscurity of something like this.
In the long ago, there was a magazine. I think it was Dragon and Dungeons. Don't quote me on the name of it, but there was a magazine that was published specifically with content for Dungeons and Dragons that was not owned by Wizards of the Coast. That was this third-party endeavor that just put out publications with interesting adventure ideas and like design monsters and like here's what you can do for your players and stuff. And like there was a thing before the internet. And for all of you Zoomers that are listening, a magazine is kind of like an email. Well, an email was kind of like a direct message before that was a thing. It was like on paper, like you had to hold it in your hands. It was a whole thing.
All right, Josh. Well, speaking of modern media, you and I, for our feature on this episode, are going to review Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. But before we get into that, I want to talk about my listening ecosystem. I assume you have a listening ecosystem as well.
A listening ecosystem,
this is developed. When I was a kid, your listening ecosystem was when you're in the car, you turn on the radio.
Yes. Okay. I agree.
Okay. And maybe at home, you might have some cassettes and later some CDs that you listen to of your favorite artists. And you would find a new one and you'd listen to it until you knew all the songs. And then you'd get bored of that when you'd put in another and you'd go through phases and stuff in your life. And you would have a listening ecosystem.
Okay. You're kind of, I don't know, you're kind of blending like physical means of enjoying Audible content and then also the content itself. Like we're not talking about playlists. We're talking about the way that you ingest like Audible stuff.
No, I'm talking about both because one is like the availability and pervasiveness of the physical media. Like it was like a CD players when they first came out, portable CD players, like if you moved them, they would skip. So you couldn't and they were kind of bulky and heavy and like you couldn't wear one while you were mowing the lawn. It just wouldn't work. But once they became iPods or later your phone and you could put on good like noise canceling headphones, now suddenly the amount of time you could listen was expanded.
Oh man, my parents bought me an MP3 player when I was in college. An MP3 player. That's all it did, kids. Like it was just for listening to music. And then I remember that thing being so old. I had an extra It had this little dongle attached to it where you would unscrew a cap and put a AA battery into it and then screw the cap back on and plug it in so you could have more than like 2 hours of listening time.
Yeah. So you have these things have transformed over time. There's always been genres of music and things that you can and choose to listen to. And then there's also the technology that enables that. And I think ultimately at the top end of that is if the technology is sufficiently unobtrusive, like I don't got to worry about charging, it's wireless, it doesn't have interference, it's easy to access, all those kinds of things, then I reach like the maximum level of listening that I would choose in my life, which is I'm doing it when I'm working, I'm doing it when I'm driving, I might do it while I'm even doing some other activity.
Okay. Yeah.
And that at that upper level then is what do I choose to fill that? If that was just empty containers, what do I choose to fill those empty containers with?
I see. As technology has made this more available, as things have improved and we have more time in our lives and the ability to seamlessly incorporate audible content, what content do you pick?
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm presenting here. What do you fill those containers with? So obviously, what we're participating in here, podcasting, is one choice you could potentially use. And obviously, the people we're speaking to are people who also choose to at least fill some or all of their time with podcasting.
We appreciate you very much. Now, if you're a patron subscriber, we appreciate you even more.
And some podcasts have just filled this demand by becoming regular. Weekly or daily or whatever. I listen to a couple that are daily and weekly and some that are irregular that just release as content becomes available.
More evidence that you live in a different timeline than I do because there's not enough hours in the day to do the things that you do. Are you aware of that? Are you on a 36-hour day, Ben?
and then there's I also choose to listen to I like music, and sometimes I feel like if all these containers are here and one of them gets too full with one kind of thing, I'm like, that's enough for that for now. Let's turn off the people talking and just listen to some music.
Yeah, that waxes and wanes, I think. Like that's with anybody, even with music genres. There's a while where you're fixated on this, and then like you get tired of it, and you want something new-ish, and you go back. Yeah.
And when I'm in the kitchen and the kids are coming in and out, I'm much more likely to just turn on like dancey music than I am like a deep podcast or an involved fiction book.
Makes sense.
And then I get my monthly Audible credit. I don't know how many of our listeners, Audible sponsors the podcast. I get my monthly Audible credit, and it's also like an irregular podcast. And here's the thing. If you start to get these containers that are full or mostly full of things that are replenishing themselves, like weekly or daily or monthly podcasts, that fills up the containers most of the way. And things like listening to music can kind of fill in as needed. But when you get something like an Audible book come along, bam, that's like 20 hours of content. And that kind of pushes other things out of the way.
Definitely, yeah.
So recently I started 2 really long books, Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson and Truman by David McCullough, which is a biography of former United States President Harry Truman.
I assumed it wasn't about the movie Truman with Jim Carrey, but... Yeah.
No. And that book is like 56 hours long.
Oof, okay.
Yeah, it's like longer than the Bible. And so I had this just almost like to use an apropos expression, like an atom bomb drop on my listening ecosystem.
Is this just a really long, fancy way of complaining that I made you read a fiction book you didn't really like?
I was going to characterize it like that.
I'm feeling like that's the message under the message.
And I'm reserving my right to give my final judgment on Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. Anyway... Sometimes these rocks that get thrown into the pond of my listening ecosystem, I can just absorb them. But sometimes it just upsets everything so much that now I don't know what to do. And this is the case. I dropped 70 hours of content on my ecosystem, and now I'm behind on all my like weeklies and dailies so far that I might not get caught up, and I don't know what to do. Do I like skip ahead in time? Do I, what do I do?
All right, so for weeklies, you just keep them going. You just go in sequence because there's a random week where you get to listen to 2 and then you can eventually catch up, and it's nice to have the buffer where you don't have to wait for the next one. The dailies, I'm going to call you a madman. Who listens to a daily podcast? Who publishes a daily podcast? How long is it? What is it about?
It's only 10 minutes long, but it could be like news or something. But imagine for the sake that he releases about the same quantity over a 2-week period of content as you and I do. Imagine you just took our podcast and chopped it up into daily segments.
Aw, I would love /hate talking to you every day, Ben.
Yeah. So, okay, but it blew up my ecosystem, and it made me wonder, what are other people's listening ecosystems like?
Okay, so it was enough of a disruption that you started thinking about the thing itself, and
Yes.
then you started getting curious about it. Okay, that makes sense.
How would you describe yours?
My listening ecosystem is it's all on my phone. Everything's on the phone because like your phone is just your personal computer that you carry around with you all day with all your settings on it.
Yeah, and it can connect to your car, and it can connect to your headphones. And
ever since I was a pool guy, again in the long, long ago.
Yes, this allowed you time to establish your listening ecosystem.
Yes, and I had so much time. And so since then I've always had those earbuds. Now these are old school. Young snappers, don't make fun of me. But the ones that I have are the buds that are still connected by a wire with like a little controller like halfway up one side on your neck. So I could take them out of my ears physically, and then they magnet together around my neck. So it's like a necklace. So if I'm not listening, they just...
Nice. What brand are they?
Oh, just some knockoff ones. Like just whatever Amazon had for $25. I that's not true. They're like $50. I'm not Beats by Dre. I'm not dropping $300 on listening.
But it sounds like they had some physical properties that allowed them to help. Like I assume if you were, I don't know, like changing out the sand on a salt pool filter, and they fell out of your ears and went down into things, it could be like a huge problem.
Right. And so the pods. When I was working all day, get up, go to work, and work all day and be done. Like I needed something that had the battery life that would last 8 solid hours of nonstop listening and phone talk, and the wired ones were the only ones that had the battery life that long. These the ones that I have now are 2 or 3 years old, but the battery is still going. They're not great, but they work. And I'm a function over form guy. When these break, I probably will get the removable, just the buds, like with no wire, because that's the cool new thing. And I don't have the need for the battery life anymore. But I will say I wear these things all day, every day. They are part of my attire. I have my keys, my wallet, my phone, and my headphones at all times.
Okay. And then, so during that time, you kind of establish, I don't know, like your playlists and and your books. How would you characterize your containers? Like if you were to make it a pie chart?
It's 95% books, 5% podcasts.
Okay.
And of that 5%, like half of that is our podcast. I listen to us, which is weird. But
any music?
I listen to music with my family. Like if I'm in the car driving, doing any work, I'm not listening to music by myself. If I'm actually at work, that's the only time that I will ever turn on music, because music you don't have to really pay attention to enjoy. Whereas like spoken word content, like an audiobook or a podcast, you really need to be paying attention. And my job needs my attention, so I can't spare that.
Yeah, so you kind of constrain the listening time where you have solitude to the things that you can give attention to.
Now, what's interesting about my ecosystem, now that you got me thinking about it, is the life cycle. Because what I do is I'll listen. I don't pick a book, Ben. I pick a book series, and it's always fiction. And I will read the entire series, like back to back to back.
So you make one small decision that then has long consequences.
Yes, right now I'm on the 3rd book of a trilogy, and that's with Warbreaker between the 2nd and 3rd book, because I need to refresh myself on it, even though I've listened to it like 5 times. But now I'm listening to the 3rd book of this one, and now once I'm done with this series, I'll have this period of atrophy where I don't know what to do, what to listen to next. And so
yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
I fill that period. It'll last like a week, and I'll fill it with podcasts. And I have a bunch of podcasts that are backlogged that I will listen to. And I'll listen to all of those, and then I will pick a new book series, and then that will be my thing. Usually, it's been it's fallen behind, but once every 1.5 to 2 years, I will decide I want to listen to The Wheel of Time again. And that's 13 40-hour books. And so that just...
Wow.
That's usually takes me about
that's
good
like
400
hours of content. Just bam.
And it takes about 7 or 8 months for me to get through all of them.
Okay. Wow, that's really interesting. It's very different than mine.
Well, what happens, and this is what's really interesting, is I also have the Audible credits. You get 15 Audible, sponsor the podcast. If you like audiobooks, it's $15 a month and you get a credit. And here's the thing, audiobooks are expensive. They're like $40, but your credit buys any audiobook. It doesn't matter how long it is. So
Yeah.
it's $15 a month, and
And
you
you
get
can
one free
listen to
audiobook.
it as many times as you want.
But they cap out at like 6. And what happens to me is I'll be listening to these series, and every month I'll get a credit and be like, hey, you have a credit. Hey, you have another credit. And I'll be like, hey, you've got 6 credits. You can't have any more. So you need to use them before they expire. And I'll go, oh, thanks, Audible. Appreciate the reminder. I will download 6 books. Usually it's 2 trilogies. And then I'll cancel my membership for like a year.
I always stay up so that I've got a backlog of books I want to download, and I'm waiting for my next credit to arrive. So I'm in a very different place than you.
Very different, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, audience, what is your listening ecosystem like? Obviously, if you're hearing my voice right now, it includes us. I'm going to try to find a visual way to represent this, and I'll put it in the graphics that I include with the episode, and we'll see if we can depict the difference between yours and mine.
Well, I'm on record as saying, like, if you don't already, like, obviously you probably do because you're listening to this podcast right now. But, like, audio content like this and audiobooks especially are like the sand that fills in all of the time that you didn't realize that you have. Anytime I'm folding laundry, anytime I'm pulling weeds in the front yard, I have some type of content going. And it just makes my life nicer.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I like the way it allows my brain to engage on multiple levels. Well, speaking of our brains getting old, you put in the notes here that you'll be legally old this year. What is that all about?
All right, Ben. So it is the year 2023. And this year I will turn 40.
Oh.
40. So I didn't think anything of it. Like, honestly, age is just a lap count around the sun. You're only as old as you feel. And I feel about 17 years old, still trying to figure crap out. But my wife informed me, because she's an HR expert, that we're talking about equal opportunity laws. At the federal and the state levels, there are what's called protected classes, okay? So if you feel that you are being discriminated against based on one of these protected classes, then you can go lodge an equal opportunity complaint, and a separate third-party government organization will do a full investigation to discern whether or not that is true. And this is an organization my wife has to deal with on a regular basis because she's in a large enough organization that people make these kinds of accusations, sometimes baselessly, but sometimes very pointedly. Like, this guy is legitimately discriminating against me because of this factor. And she informed me that of these protected classes, which is something, do not quote me on this, I'm not an HR expert, she is.
Sure.
But it's usually race, religion, and age. Age is one of the protected classes. And I was like, oh, so it's an age difference, right? Like if an old person is discriminating against a young person or vice versa. And she goes, nope, it's 40. So if you are 40 or older, you belong to a protected class of federally, legally old people.
Awesome. All right, so you're coming up on legally old.
Which, I mean... I don't know. Yeah, it's a testament to my ability not to die, which is always a good thing, getting older. But I don't know how I feel about the federal government giving me their stamp of like old. Like that's not nice. Federal government. Like, I don't feel like I'm old.
Like the only time you aren't aspiring to belong to a protected class.
Well, there's always these stepping stones to
now.
Getting
Hang
older.
on, let's not get hasty here. I don't want to be called old just yet.
Well, we have these milestones artificially built into our lives, and it's like, oh, when you turn 16, you get to drive. When you turn 18, you get to vote. When you turn 21, you get to drive. You get to drink beer, rather. When you turn, what is it, like 25 or 26, you get to rent a car.
Rent a car, yeah.
Yeah. When you turn, 30, you're just 30.
Yeah, you run out of milestones at that point.
Welcome to the middle. But no, we have not. But there's the young end, like on the uphill side. Like look at the bell curve of ages. On the uphill, we talked about all of those milestones, right? But now we're on all the ones on the downhill side. This is where they start my milestones for being old. At 40, I'm legally old. At 50 or 55, I'm going to start getting AARP magazine. Or I'm going to start falling into like the senior citizen discount. At like 63, I'm going to start getting letters from the Social Security Administration like, hey, you can take out your Social Security now.
Yeah, and 40 sounds way earlier than you'd expect to be called legally old. Like, you don't get any benefits yet at that point. You don't get a senior citizen discount.
I do get a benefit, Ben. I belong to a federally protected class. If I go to a bank and try to get a loan, if I try to buy a home and they say no, I can be like, ha! That's because I'm old, isn't it? And I can go down to this government bureaucracy to have them come and investigate.
Okay. All right. Well, congratulations on almost being legally old, Josh.
Again, I'm mixed feelings.
Why did I not know that? That feels like it's not common knowledge.
Well, because it doesn't impact us the way that it impacts people that are, actually
work in HR.
Yeah, because my wife deals with it all the time.
Yeah.
And also there are people that are let's just say of the classes that are discriminated against, age isn't the one that has the majority of the pie chart of complaints.
Yeah. I think you're probably right. We're going to shake things up a bit, and I think you've got a bat at English for us today, or at least you're going to kick off the discussion.
I will kick off this discussion with, it's almost like a shower thought. I don't know. My brain was in a weird spot, and then something happened near me, and I'll give you the whole story. Here it is. I think we were sitting down to a meal. I don't know which meal it was, but my wife was eating something, and my son, as he's prone to do, asked her a question, because the way that children engage with adults is asking them all of the questions. And so my wife responded in the negative, but her mouth was full because she was eating, and she is a polite woman. And so instead of speaking with her mouth full, she made the audible noise that is a negative response. And that's
audience, you're thinking of it right now, and you're right. Josh is going to do it. Go ahead.
It's a mm-mm. And that's clearly the negative response. But for some reason, my brain was in a state. I was analyzing the universe at that moment. And I said out loud, where does that come from? That's not the word no. She's not saying no just with her mouth shut. It's a completely separate phrase. And not only is it a separate phrase, it is a distinct phrase. It has no words.
You're calling it a phrase. Is that nonverbal?
But it is verbal. It's verbal in the sense that it's noise that you are making that is communicating information.
But it's a different set of verbal.
Yeah, it's like what we are doing right now. That is spoken language. We are using our disgusting orifices to make distinct noises that impart arbitrary meaning that we have assigned to these specific noises, right?
Okay.
It's the same thing, just it's not language. It's just with your mouth shut. So it's like a mouth shut language. And this is what blew my mind, is because there are other ways that we do this that have direct one-to-one translations to verbal language. Like, hey, Ben, do not open your mouth and tell me that you don't know the answer to my next question. You see there? That's a thinking noise. We know that you're thinking or stalling. There's a Everybody knows what that means, but that one, that is I don't know, said with your mouth shut without moving your jaw.
All right, Josh, let me try one. Okay, without opening your mouth, tell me that you're thinking deeply about what I just said.
Ben, without opening your mouth, tell me that you're open to playing some Magic Gathering later. If you want to say yes, yes, this is the yes and no are so weird because it's not even different sounds. It's the same sounds with different inflection. Yes is no is those are the same sounds.
Okay, I'm going to tell you something that's going to blow your mind, Josh. So when I got to Italy, if you remember from episode 9 of Bad at Magic Podcast, I talked about my story where I had to get really deep into the Italian economy.
The Italian job. Go listen to episode 9.
Yeah, so I was really getting deep with the Italians, and I've met a few that spoke English in that they knew English words, but they didn't have English culture. And I had this problem that there was one of these noises you and I were just making back to each other that they used that had the opposite meaning of the one we use.
Ooh, that's lost in translation. What was it?
Yes, it's this one.
That's no. That's no.
In Italy, that's an affirmative noise.
Get out of town.
No, it totally is. And the first couple of times Andrea did it, I was really confused until I realized he was affirming what I was saying, but he was using the word, the sound that we use that's for negative.
Oh, and you're so polite. You let him just keep telling you no to your face without correcting him.
No, because they use that in Italian when they're speaking to other Italians. They use that sound. He wasn't trying to speak English. He was just affirming.
Right, but
So I was the one that needed to learn, not him. What was I supposed to tell him that's bad English to go and mean yes?
No. That's just a translation error, right?
Is it though? I think it's a mix. Have you ever heard of someone speaking Spanglish?
I live in Arizona. Yes, people speak Spanglish here a lot.
So when you told me you wanted to talk about this, I tried to look it up. So I went to the Cambridge Dictionary and I found nuh-uh, which you kind of have to do with your mouth open, but it's the closest I could find. And it doesn't offer any kind of etymology or origin or anything like that. It just says it means a sound that people make when they disagree with someone.
Yeah, but how do they spell it? Because, again, even the spellings
They spelled
of these
it
two...
N-U-H-U-H.
Yeah, and you see, and what's the positive version of that just drops the N. That's all it does, I'll bet. I'm willing to bet that the positive version, the is just UHUH.
Yes, used in writing to represent the sound that people sometimes make to give an affirmative answer.
So it's just, even like the internet, in all of its wisdom, doesn't know. These are just sounds that we have made since caveman era, and it's just floated through the eons.
But in some cultures, they could have a different meaning.
I don't know. Like this might be in that little fringe of things.
I don't think it's universal. That's the point I'm making. I don't think it's universal.
Well, no, it's not universal. It's definitely influenced by culture, obviously, with your Italian explanation. But this is one of those things that I think I've identified as a weird, archaic carryover of just a weird quirk of our existence that we don't think about because it's so ingrained and normal. I don't know. For me, like having these little epiphanies, like I just like I don't know, it makes me feel like I'm seeing the code in the Matrix. It's like I'm looking at, the mechanics or the numbers or the dice rolling of how the universe works when I identify these little things.
And that's what we do here on the Bad at Magic podcast. We look at the code of the Matrix. For Bad at Rhetoric this week, I would like to talk about Accumulatio. Or Accumulatio. I don't know how to say it. It's in Latin. It means to heap up or to amass. The rhetorical method here that we're using is bringing together various points made throughout a speech and presenting them again in a forceful climatic way. A blend of summary and climax. I think of this as like what's happening when you're losing an argument with your spouse. Accumulatio.
Reiterating my points at a higher volume to make it seem like I'm making a new one.
Yeah, so I was thinking about when I see this in writing, like the closing argument in a trial. You're trying to bring together all of the logic and eloquence and evidence that you've given to a single point so that the jury will go away and deliberate and decide in your favor.
Well, I mean, this is the classic structure of any written argument. This is, you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them. You tell them. And then you tell them what you told them. You have an intro, you have the middle, which is explaining each of your points in detail, and then, like, once you have explained each one and proven to them individually that these points are irrefutable, you get to the end of your discussion, your written discourse, your speech, whatever. You reiterate the points that you just made that we all agreed, while I've been talking, that these are irrefutable points. Let me say them again.
And that is your accumulatio. So the one that came to mind when I was thinking of rhetoric and thinking of this was the Independence Day speech on the airfield by Bill Pullman as President of the United States in the classic Alien Invasion movie.
Okay, so that movie is... I don't know, maybe we should review that movie at some point because I feel like there's some highs and lows in that movie. But I will say that the speech of somebody who never would have been elected president in a million years is a high point in American cinema. Like
it
that,
is.
Like you can be the most socialist commie bastard, and you will stand up and salute the flag listening to that speech.
It's a great speech. It's a minute and a half long, and I would try to do a rendition of it now, but I wouldn't do it justice. So I'll put a link in the show notes because it has this swelling patriotic music in the background where he ends by saying, "We will not vanish. We will not go quietly. We will not go away without a fight. We will live on. We're going to survive. Today is our Independence Day."
All right, dang it. This is another tangent, but have you ever noticed, like in movies, they'll do that where they'll have like big swelling music and then just take a second and think, without the music, this would look really stupid.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to give this one a pass. Like without the music, it's still pretty good.
Yeah, I'll give you that.
Yeah, but definitely agree with that. Like, in fact, I love, this is another thing the internet is for. It's for doing these kinds of things where like they take things and actually do that and illustrate it. I'll see if I can find a good example and put it in the show notes. But I saw one like Meghan Trainor's It's All About the Bass that only has bass and it sounds horrible.
We were watching The Replacements, 2000 movie with Keanu Reeves. if you remember that one. There is a scene where the entire football team is in jail. They're locked up after a bar fight. And, like, the music swells, and it's I Will Survive, the classic disco ballad.
Yeah.
And they're all doing the electric slide to it. And I couldn't help but think to myself, without the music, these are just a bunch of drunken idiots doing the electric slide in a jail cell.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some, I think, entire YouTube channel that's dedicated to doing this where they show like music videos, but with the music turned off, and you could just hear sounds of them grunting and their feet scuffing on the floor and stuff like that.
Outstanding.
It's just absurd. My family recently did a board game Survivor with a game we'd had sitting around for a long time called Scotland Yard. Have you ever played it?
I've never heard of it.
Okay, Scotland Yard, I did a bit of research, and it's an oldie. Apparently, it came around in 1983. It's a real simple concept. It's a one versus many board game concept where it's set in the city of London. And it's a police chase, and you have a team of police. They're trying to track down a fugitive, and you just have a mechanism for them escaping and you trying to track them down and cooperating in hidden and known information.
Okay.
So it's designed for 2 to 6 players, but it's best in its 6-player configuration where you have 5 people trying to find one person. And the way the mechanics of the game works is that the one person has to reveal what form of transportation they use to go to their next. So you have a board game that's a map of the city of London in numbered spots across the board. There's like 300 of them or something, 200 of them.
Okay.
And they transport from each turn, every person transports from one place to another.
Okay.
And your 5 people are trying to coordinate openly to zero in on where this person is, and you know what method of transportation they used. The problem is every 3 to 6 moves, they have to reveal where they're at.
Oh, where they are?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So every few moves, it pops up, and you're like, oh, he's over there, and then he disappears again.
This is like the movie The Fugitive that you like so much, where
yes.
they'll get the tip, and he'll appear, and they'll all congregate to him.
It's kind of like that. It's unique, and it's this cooperative multiplayer where you're trying to work together, and you have limited resources, and you're working through all of that. The problems with the game are, and maybe you can just fill these blanks in yourself, is that there's no story. Like there's just you just drop you in London, and you're a bunch of guys trying to get a guy.
Oh, that's super easy to fix that problem, Ben.
Yeah.
You just have the person that's running that like set the board game up. He has to wear a Sherlock Holmes hat and get one of those big curly pipes. And then the guy who's going to be the fugitive has to wear like a dastardly mustache and a cape. And you put on a little 2-minute skit before you get started.
They call him Mr. X, and so that you can't see him picking his next move on the board, they give him a visor, and it says Mr. X on it. But honestly, that's a terrible name. Also, the iconography of it suffering a little bit. I don't know if you've ever seen the iconic London Tube map, but one of the things that the map designer did for that made them almost a case study in map making was that they exaggerated or diminished the distances to make it have maximum visual appeal.
Right, because in a lot of ways, like a map of a subway system for travel is not about the distance that's being traveled. It's about how I'm going to get to the destination.
Right. It's just about the number of stops.
Yeah.
So you just need everything to kind of be spaced nicely and easy to read at a moment's notice.
Yes, it's informational, not geographic.
Right. So this board game is kind of suffering from that because it's an actual map of London and the numbers are kind of tiny. And from each stop, you can either take a taxi or a bus or a train. Anyway.
You couldn't set that in America because you can either take an Uber, and that's your option.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess if you were to pile your own story on top of it and really enjoy the interaction of trying to cooperate with all these other people to capture this person, it could be fun. This is one of those games that definitely, well, not that any isn't, but is only as fun as your play group.
Definitely, yes. You have to have people into the game to be enjoying it.
We were kind of mixed at the end. It wasn't like it was almost like a 50-50 split of people that thought we should get rid of it or keep it. It's on the naughty spot right now.
I'll tell you what, give it another shot, and I want you to do a couple of changes to try to add some stuff.
Okay, this is good.
Okay? Like just off the top of my head, like because the mechanics are all there, but what you're talking about, you're missing is the story element, like the engagement. You want the players to engage with what they're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
So you should make it a requirement that Mr. X not only reveals what method of transportation he used to get to the place, but why he is going to that place. And it could be a stupid reason. It's like, oh, I took a taxi.
You got to make up a story.
Yeah, and so there's kind of it turned like, you will be amazed, like when you task somebody with coming up with a random thing, how quickly everybody will clue in and like latch onto the storytelling and start elaborating. Like it'll turn into an improv in no time.
Okay,
like, it's like,
I like it.
I'm taking a taxi to go get a sticky bun, and just let that hang, and I'll bet you'll have better engagement and a funner time that way.
Okay.
And the second, like, yeah, give a little at the beginning. Give a little, like, it could be from history. You can make it up, like some 45-second like reading of like, this person murdered, some old lady because she discovered that, he was embezzling from a corporation or whatever, and we're on the hunt. Like, give him a backstory.
Nice. You're right. And I think some games have this aspect where even if it wasn't deliberate, you can fill in some blanks on your own and make it more fun.
I think this is a good opportunity for that.
Okay, cool. All right, well, Scotland Yard is still on the naughty spot, but we'll give it another shot, and I think we'll take those suggestions. For our main segment today, Josh, you and I are going to discuss Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I'm going to start with our customary spoiler warning, but I want to say something else. And that is, if you are on the edge about whether or not to read this, you can or you can't. I don't think that I don't feel like... Okay, there's lots of double crosses and twists and turns in this book, but I think you can enjoy this discussion we're about to have, regardless if you are ever going to read this book.
Wow. Just blanket permission slip for, you don't really have to read it. I mean, we're going to talk about it, but you don't have to read it.
Now give your counterpoint. If you think that this book is so great, everyone should read it, and they definitely shouldn't know what happens in it before they read it, go ahead, give your spoiler warning.
Okay, so, yeah, spoilers for Warbreaker and probably for Star Wars at some point. But my synopsis of this book is, I'll tell you right now, Ben, when it popped up at the end and Audible asked me to review the book, first of all, performance I put to 5 because the voice actress that does the voices,
she did great.
Wonderful job. There was never in any doubt who was speaking at any time. Second, it's story. And I'll tell you, Ben, this is one of the few books from Brandon Sanderson that I actually marked him down to 4 stars on the story.
Wow.
I have, without doing any spoilers right now, I feel like the ending is a bit rushed. It feels that way to me. I don't know if it was or not. I don't know the meta details.
I thought it was as well.
It felt that way, and it felt like the meat and potatoes of this book is about the characters and the story, and there's not the characters in the story in the middle. Like, there's not a huge, like, in-your-face conflict. It's kind of a long-standing brewing thing, which is very more true to life. And I appreciated the development and the arcs of the characters in a very real-to-life scenario.
Have you ever done a thing that you're reading a book and you want to talk to somebody that's read it before and say, just tell me it's going to be okay? Like Fred Savage on The Princess Bride, where he's like, Grandpa, does Wesley get Humperdinck? Like that.
Yeah.
So I went to my wife at some point and I'm like, please tell me this is not the first in a 5-part series. I just want it to come to an end.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, I thought I'm so mad at you now. Like, I thought for a second, like, I care so much about this character. Please tell me this character is going to live or be okay, or this is going to resolve. No, you just didn't want to read anymore.
Give me an assurance that it actually has a conclusion at the end of the book.
Good fiction is wasted on you, Ben. Wasted. We are in a golden age of storytelling, and all you want to do is read autobiographies of people.
Ugh. Oh, man. Yes, I need this to be over so I could go back to Harry Truman's story.
Killing me, Smalls.
That's a fascinating story, by the way. Anyway.
Don't stop. All right. Yes, there's a structure. We're going to follow it. Every time the fiction stories come out and I try to lay out, like, this is what we're going to do, and it turns into this tangled, chaotic nightmare of a conversation that we have with tangents and stories and whatever. Here's what we need to try to do, Ben.
Okay.
We need to try to have, like, a quick plot synopsis. What actually, no kidding, happens in this book, okay? And then, once we get through that, we'll just let it go. I'm done with it. We'll just let it go and talk about whatever we want.
All right.
Then when we get closer to the end, we'll have to do our summary of the magic system and then talk about that.
Carry on, good sir.
Okay. Plot synopsis without getting into too much detail, because we'll talk about the details. This is set in a world that has, like, the biggest tension in the conflict is that there is a culture that has living gods. Something about the magic system, a person can die, and then 1 in 100 million or something, some huge astronomical number, they will come back to life, and they will live for 1 week with no memories of their previous life in some amazing, like, their body gets bigger and they turn beautiful, and then they die again. Unless you feed them with the magic in this system, which is people's biochroma. Like, everybody is born with, they call it breath. And they were trying, like some.
But it isn't necessary for life. It's just something you have.
It's just something you have, and people can give it up. And they have found ways using the mechanics of the system that you can give up your breath, or people can have more than one. And then if you have more than one, cool things happen where you can actually imbue it into inanimate objects and make them come pseudo-alive for a little while before reclaiming
So as a tribute to their gods, they bring someone who gives up their breath to the god to prolong their immortal life.
Once a week, these living gods are given a breath of a person, and they think that they're prophetic, and they are worshipped as deities, and they run this kingdom, which is at the center of this trade hub, and it's like it's built to be this very powerful kingdom, okay?
But the breaths aren't consumed, they're just added.
Transferred, yes. The only time breath actually goes away is if a person holding breath dies without giving it up first.
Or they can give them up. And apparently you can't just give up one. You either give them all up that you have, or you keep them.
Right. We're dipping into the magic system, but the magic system takes a backseat to the character story, okay? What we have is a very powerful kingdom of a certain religious sect, and then a neighboring kingdom that are seen as de facto rebels or whatever, of a different sect that don't believe what they believe. And as a long-time standing treaty, this small rebel kingdom is required to give a daughter of the royal line to the main kingdom to try to legitimize, like,
because the royal
stuff.
line has some kind of magical properties that legitimizes the king.
And the history of it is, like, they were all part of one kingdom, and then the royal line was, like, exiled at some point, or, like, got kicked out by some other guy who usurped the throne. There's differing opinions on what happened in history. This is very true to life. You have two countries that both will agree that they were one country at the beginning, and both have disagreements on how it came to be and how it's supposed to be resolved.
Yeah.
And so they have this long-standing treaty where the small kingdom is supposed to give up the daughter, one of the daughters, to the other kingdom to marry their god king and live happily ever after, whatever.
No, to generate an heir.
Well, yeah, but the treaty is to, like...
That's the real tension of the plot.
That's the real tension, is that there is no love lost between these kingdoms. It's like, you're going to give up a daughter for one reason only, so that our lineage will now have the royal, like, DNA. The royal bloodline will come back. It's to legitimize, what we're doing or whatever.
Yes.
And the beginning of this book starts with the father talking about how he doesn't want to send his oldest daughter because he just likes her too much. And he straight up does not like his third daughter at all.
She's rebellious.
Well, and she's
flighty and doesn't pay attention to her lessons.
And they talk about it like the oldest was groomed from birth. You are going to marry the God King. You need to know this stuff. The oldest boy is sent to, he's learning to run the kingdom. Then the second daughter was sent off to the church to be a good, priest person. And the third daughter is just like, well, then we had a third daughter and she's just kind of here. And so the dad finally realized, you know what? I'm not going to send them my daughter because I like her too much. I'm going to send them my third daughter because I don't like her at all. And so we have, that's like the first chapter.
Yeah, favorite child syndrome. And I thought this was going to be it, that the king was going to be one of our main characters and stuff, but he disappears after this.
Never hear a word from him again.
It's all about the oldest daughter, Vivenna, and the youngest daughter, Ciri. Those are our two protagonists.
So I'm going to plot without getting too much into it. Ciri is sent, the third daughter. She is sent to marry the God King. Everybody's a little like, why did they send this daughter? That was very clever. All these political machinations. Ha ha ha. She marries the God King. She gets embroiled into the court politics of what's going on there. In a parallel story, we have Vivenna, who is completely displaced, doesn't know what her life is supposed to be now. She comes down to the city to be like, well, I'm going to save my sister because she wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be here. And like a really vague kind of motivation for like, I just want to do good. And like, I thought this was what I was supposed to do.
No, I like the way you characterized it. She had purpose up until the point in her life when her father decided to change the plan. And now she doesn't have a point anymore, so she's looking for one.
So she falls in, or she goes and finds like her father's spies that are in the city, who immediately dies. And then she falls in with these mercenaries and like starts to like, you know what? If war is going to come between these two nation states, we should be in a good spot to do it. And so she gets involved and is trying to rally and trying to undermine like the logistics of this kingdom, and is like doing like domestic terrorist stuff.
Thinking that she has snuck into this city and is successfully living incognito.
Yes. So we have, these are the two main storylines, and these are way oversimplified, and there's a ton of stuff going on in the background. And unlike Ben, I would encourage you to read it because I found it a great and engaging, thrilling book. Even if it is just about politics, it felt very true to life of these subtle, long-term manipulations and the way that nations interact with each other.
Okay, so commence spoilers. In the first act sets up everything you just said. In the second act, the double crosses start.
So the second act, we have Ciri discovering more of the secrets of the inner court and the ruling class.
Everything was not as it seems.
No, like the God King was was portrayed to her as this ultimate ruler that has the power of life and death over everybody. Turns out,
is oppressing her people,
and is just rules with an iron fist. Well, it turns out this person is little more than a child, a puppet. Yeah, like legitimately, like they cut his tongue out. So where all the other gods are given 1 breath a week to sustain their existence, he's given 3 or 4, and so he has tons and tons of breath, which is essentially the fuel for the magic in this universe. And like the idea is there's things that you can do with breath, but they're very specific ways that you have to enact it. There are words that you have to say. There are things that you have to touch. If colors involved, like it's very well done. It's very hard. We'll talk about that later. But the idea is, yes, spoken word is vital to enabling the magic in this universe. And they cut his tongue out when he was an infant because he's not allowed to use any of it. He's just supposed to be a storage container for it all. And he just does what his priests tell him to. Like, he can't read, he can't write, he interacts with nobody. Like, he is this aloof character that everybody's like, oh, he's too powerful to be with anyone. And he's just like in his big palace, kind of like drumming his knees, waiting for the next meal or waiting for the next time somebody gives him a picture book to look at.
Can I take a second and give some props to Brandon Sanderson right now? Because sometimes when I'm reading a book and I get a feeling like this dialogue isn't quite right, it's usually just because the author's taking some liberties. But in this case, Brandon Sanderson wanted me to have that feeling. And it was early on when we're meeting the God King and the priests and stuff, and the priests are interacting with Princess Ciri, Queen Ciri, now that she's married to the God King. I was like, why are the priests kind of backtalky and bossy? Like, they don't seem like they're subjects to the king and queen. It feels like they're really running the place. But it was just a feeling you were getting. And it pays off. Like, it doesn't just turn out that this is a kingdom where the priests and the servants in the court are backtalky. No, it was because he was hiding the fact that really they're the ones running the place.
Right. In a very legitimate, practical sense. And yeah, so Ciri's whole thing is she's this fish out of water, and eventually she discovers the God King is not what he seems to be, and they start developing like an actual friendship and relationship. She teaches him how to write and communicate, and they start talking to each other, and she's teaching him about the world outside of this tiny, narrow scope that he has. And Brandon Sanderson does a great job of making him skeptical of some of the things that he says. The God King, like, she tries to say, like, your priests are like not supposed to be doing this. And he's like, no, they're doing, the best they can for everyone. It's like, yeah, that's what he would think if he had been raised by them his whole life. And he's been ruling there for like 300 years and has no interaction with anybody but his priests. Yes, he would implicitly trust them with stuff like this.
Yeah.
And then she starts interacting with some of the other gods of the court, which we didn't mention, but one of the other main characters is one of the gods of the court, like struggling with his own self-identity as a god. The entire book, he is questioning his place, like, I don't feel like a god. Why am I a god? And his head priest, who is constantly like at his elbow following him around, like, it's fine, sir. You are a god. Just shut up. You're our god. Just do the god thing. And Lightsong is the
Lightsong and Larimar.
Lightsong and Larimar, also known as Scoot. The Lightsong calls him Scoot the whole book because, you like to scoot from place to place. And I think I enjoyed
the humor that he imbued into that character.
Lightsong, yes. And Lightsong is an interesting character, and I really like him too. Like, we're going on tangents again before we're getting through Act 2. But I like Lightsong because he's supposed to be this god, but he's such a frivolous person. And he's constantly questioning everything that like this whole society is built on. And he's surrounded by people that take everything super serious, but he's the boss. And so he's, without realizing it, and it kind of comes crashing on him later in the book when he's just being like this flippant, like not taking anything seriously, and everybody else take everything really seriously, and finally realizes that he's actually pissing a lot of people off. Like, even Larimar starts yelling at him. It's like, what is wrong with you? Like, we try so hard to, like, you are this divine thing, and you don't take anything seriously. Like, and it's just a great, like, this, like, wake up slap in the face scene for Lightsong. Like, dude, you're screwing it up for everybody else here.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, so that's
okay. So that's series plotline and
plotline.
Light Song's plotline. Now we got Vivenna.
Vivenna finds the spy that was in the city who was kind of embezzling funds from the other rebel kingdom and using it to buy a bunch of breath because he didn't want to die. And one of the passive benefits of having a bunch of life energy in you,
which is against her religion,
very much. Like this is an abomination to contain more than just the breath that you were born with.
And then, as his dying act, he gives it to her.
And she can't stop it. This is not something that she has any agency over whatsoever. He forcibly sends all of this breath into her.
And she now is guilty of the abomination.
And the first thing she asks is, can I give it to someone else? And like the guy, like the mercenaries that the spy had hired that now kind of defaulted into her employment, basically break it to her like it's all or nothing. If you give up your breath,
you can give it away, but you'd give away your own as well.
Yeah, and so
you'd now be what do they call it? A drab?
A drab, yes.
Someone without a breath.
So and this is everything in this. The magic system is tied to song, like sounds and color, and so like all of the words and all come from that kind of thing. And so a drab is somebody without breath. They have no color. They have no life sense. Like they appear slightly different. Apparently, it's a whole thing. So Vivenna is now like the one person that she knew she could trust, that she could rely on to like help give her some direction on achieving her extremely vague goal of saving her sister, is now dead. And she falls in with these mercenaries that the guy had hired, and they're very charismatic and very nice people. Mm-hmm. And they were informing her of what he's doing well. He was trying to destabilize their economy. He was trying to make sure they didn't have preparations to go to war with your country.
So she's using the resources she inherited to lead a guerrilla insurrection.
Yes, and it's explained to her, and they convinced her that this war between the two countries is inevitable, and so it's in the best interest of her and her people to do these domestic terrorist things.
Disrupt it.
Yes. And so then this whole struggle, like this entire second act is Vivenna struggling with like her circumstances and like coming to terms with like this horrible society that she's trying to fight against, and I'm still going to stick to my beliefs, and like this is all wrong, and she's very, very judgy. Right up until the point that a police raid almost gets her captured, when she immediately tries to do the thing where she takes I will never use these breaths to awaken any object. That is an offense to my beliefs and my God. And then she immediately tries to do it when her life is in danger. And so she starts recognizing her own hypocrisy when stuff is on the line, and like it starts to broaden her character, and it starts to wake her up to like her preconceived notions of everything that is going on around her. And then I feel so bad for her.
Okay, so that moment you just described, I actually took out my notepad and I wrote down like, okay, her character hit rock bottom. Little did I know that her character was going to hit rock bottom like 3 more times.
Oh, dude, like it just like Vivenna's whole world just keeps crumbling out from under her, and every time it feels like it stabilizes, it drops 3 more floors.
Yeah.
Like the next time we find out, time, she gets kidnapped by some other unknown entity up until this point. Like we've been seeing flashes of this character. We don't know what his motivations are.
Yeah,
he's just doing things. Vasher. And Vasher is I love Vasher. And he's just in the city, like, doing stuff. And he is not charismatic. He is very gruff. He's very blunt, very to the point.
But he's what's called an awakener.
Yes. He has a lot of breath, and he knows how to use it. And he knows how to imbue it into objects and to his own benefit.
In a way that gives him power, that he's dangerous in combat and he can sneak into places and things like that.
He awakens his shirt and he gives it commands to grab things that he, like when he tells it to. He awakens his pants to like give his legs superhuman strength. He awakens his cloak to protect him, and it will like jump up and snatch arrows out of the air like Doctor Strange's cloak.
Like Doctor Strange's cloak.
And he does this with everything. He does it randomly. Like he had he was trying to break into some place and he needed a distraction. And beforehand, he had a dead squirrel that he had prepared, and he put a breath into the squirrel to bring it to life and gave it commands: run around, make noise, bite things, be a distraction, ready, go. And this zombie squirrel is now running around this compound, like just being his distraction.
Making a distraction so he can sneak around.
But we didn't know what he was doing all of this for up to this point, right?
Yeah.
And so then he kidnaps Vivenna. This is another rock bottom point that she hits, is like he kidnaps her, ties her up, and like, you are causing problems. You are going directly counter to what I am trying to accomplish here.
But we didn't know what he was trying to accomplish.
Right. And so then he throws her in a closet and like ties her up, and then he leaves to go do his unknowable things. And then finally Vivenna does the terrible thing against her religion again, and she awakens the ropes that she's tied up with to untie them. But she doesn't know how to get the breath back. She doesn't have it anymore. And then she escapes from Vasher's place. She goes and finally makes her way back to the hideout that her and the other mercenaries were at. And the other mercenaries, while she was gone, tortured her friend to death that came down from the other palace with her, came down from the other kingdom with her, trying to figure out where she went. And then they went on this whole, like they walked in on her discovering that this guy was tortured to death. And they did the thing that supervillains do, where they assumed that the hero knew everything about their plans and then started like just spilling it all like out into the open.
Yeah.
Unbeknowingly to them, like actually telling the person all of the things that they were supposed to be keeping secret.
I think this one will come up in Bad at Rhetoric at some point, but yes.
So yeah, he monologued for a bit and spilled the beans. Turns out, actually, no, we were working directly counter to what that Spy Masters thing said.
Danth and Tonk Fa, who she thought were her allies, turned out to have been hired by someone else. Do you feel like we ever know who?
Yes, we find out who at the end, and that's part of the...
I'm not convinced. Anyway, turns out they were hired by someone else, and she was actually serving the opposite purpose she thought she was. Rather than preventing a war between the two countries, she was accelerating them towards it.
She was doing all the things in the country that they were talking about at the Court of Gods. Like, this is why.
Rather than her being secretly there, they're like, the princess from the other country is here doing guerrilla warfare. We should go to war with them.
Yes, like instead of preparing for an inevitable war, she was creating the circumstances for a war. And so that's her second rock bottom. She barely escapes from Denth and Tonk Fa in a semi-believable fashion, I will say.
Yeah.
And at one point, she dumps all of her breath into like a shawl, like just a piece of cloth, because she was trying to awaken it, but she didn't know how. And all of her breath went into this thing, and now she doesn't have any. And she ended up having to live on the street, on the run, trying to hide from these guys. Didn't know anywhere to go, didn't know anyone in the city, and she was legitimately homeless for weeks.
And starving.
Yeah, she was trying to...
So she's begging on the street, literal rock bottom.
She tried to pay her day's earnings from begging to a guy so she could eat the trash that a restaurant was throwing away, and she was turned down.
And he stole it from her.
And he stole it from her and turned her away, yeah. Like, it was just like, yeah, just kept hitting... Like, you think she gets to the bottom, it just keeps getting worse.
So she finally gets to the point where she's starting to consider prostitution.
Oof,
and she's like...
And they made it very clear in that book that, like, from the first time she saw a prostitute, what she thought of that. And like, it's just a great... the book couldn't be any shorter because it would do a disservice to this long-term transformation of Vivenna's character. Yeah. Like, we see her on her high horse in her ivory tower get knocked down every single level and then build herself back up from nothing.
And I feel like that's the end of Act 2.
Her being homeless on the street?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Act 3 then opens up with Vivenna gets picked up and found by Vasher again. Vasher, like, re-kidnaps.
But this time she's ready to listen.
Yeah, well, he basically re-kidnaps her, and they actually get a chance to talk this time. And then it turns out that they're not at odds as much as they thought they were. And then turns out
he's trying to prevent the war, and she was accelerating it, and he's like, you idiot.
Yeah.
Literally, you idiot.
Yeah, he's not a very nice person, Vasher. And then she explains, rightfully, that she had been, like, the wool pulled over her eyes by Denth, like, completely taken in by Denth. And, like, she figures out that Denth had essentially kidnapped her without her realizing it. And then, like, she doesn't really know, like, what she wants to do now. All she knows, like, Vasher gives her food. Like, Vasher's not heartless. He's a jerk, but he's not heartless. He, like, gives her food and clothes and whatever. And it's like, hey, you're going to help me undo this by talking to I'm going to go talk to some people. You're going to come and you're going to tell them what you just told me. And it's in that meeting that she's trying to figure out, like, what is her place in this? What is her role? What does she want her role to be? And this is, like, the first time she actually seriously contemplates, like, the situation and what her stance on it is. And she just comes up with, I don't know what the relationship between these two countries should be, but I know that war is bad, so we should not go to war. And like that's basically all she decides, and starts working towards that.
Yeah.
So her and Vash are doing the absolute best that they can to undo the damage that they did, and they fail miserably because they just don't have the resources.
Meanwhile, Light Song and a character named Blushweaver have kind of been at the heart of this preparation of war from the leadership, god, royalty point of view.
Right. They are trying to basically get the keys to the armory. They're working political machinations to generate, so they have full control over the armies and the war-making capacity of the kingdom. And that's what's going on over on that side. Ciri, turns out that you were, the whole purpose of having the princess was so we could generate an heir for the God King. Turns out the God King can't have kids, and we had a random infant that died that returned, and so he's going to be our new God King. So we just need you to pretend that you're pregnant long enough until we kill both of you, and then we'll have this new God King as he grows up.
Yeah, wow.
Oops, sorry. We actually don't want you here, at all.
Okay, so those are two, top tier level, double cross plot twists.
Yeah, and it was, and you're just what's going to happen?
Everything you know is wrong.
Yeah. And then this is where the rushed ending, I feel like, comes into play, because now we have a third party, which we heretofore have not mentioned, because they are not mentioned very much up until this point. There is this other little country that's completely been marginalized by the bigger country called
the Pankal.
The Pankal people, and they have a bunch of servants in the palace that have been actually the ones behind. They're the ones that hired Denth to generate this war. This was very Sum of All Fears. It's you don't fight Russia or America. You get Russia and America to fight each other. And so it's this third party that's trying to get these two superpowers to annihilate each other for the benefit of the third party. And it just, I don't know. There's a big fight. There's an actual coup that happens at the palace. The idea is that they're going to stage an assassination of the God King and his queen and make it look like it was a pagan ritual, because they all believe that this other country where the princess came from is these pagan heathens that sacrifice people on altars or whatever. And basically they design this whole thing we're going to kill both of you, so the court of gods is absolutely outraged and is going to go to war, and we're going to kill you in such a way that your country is super mad that they're going to turn from an inevitable war, and then you both are just going to annihilate each other, and it will be awesome for us.
And we'll be the last man standing and have all the power, because we'll control the God King, the new person with no tongue.
and there's a bunch of cool action that happens, and I don't know, while the motivations were weird, I like how it all played out.
Okay. Is that the end of our plot synopsis?
That's
how long do you think we could get away with having a leader with no tongue before people started getting suspicious instead of thinking he's just contemplative and above it all?
I don't know, Ben. How long do you think a religion can be built off of some unknowable, unseeable, unspeaking deity?
Fair question.
That's the thing that you have to remember is this, for these people, this is not just a form of government. This is their religion. These are actual gods that are running their kingdom.
Okay. All right. You ready to take some tangents?
Yeah, let's do the tangents. Let's talk about all of our favorite things.
Well, let me talk about an influence here. Are you familiar with the Old Testament story of Esther?
Ooh, possibly, but not off the top of my head.
Okay, so the Old Testament story of Esther is set in the time period roughly 800 years before Christ, where the Persians are in high power and the Jewish people that lived in modern-day Israel are taken captive away into northern modern-day Iraq and Syria, and there are the Jewish people kind of living there amongst the Persians. And there are some high up in the power of the government that basically resent the Jews and their position and their people, and they're trying to set up basically a genocide. They're trying to convince the king that the Jewish people are out to get him, that they need to have a day that they're going to kill them all. This is actual historically verifiable fact. Okay. And Esther apparently was a woman in the kingdom and gotten in a position where she'd found favor in the eyes of the king and was taken as one of his polyamorous wives. But this was not a kingdom like we think of where the king and the queen are husband and wife and rule together on the throne and are kind of peers. This is like it is in this book where the king is all powerful and then he just has wives that are a different class of his servants.
Essentially, yeah. They don't have any political power.
So the whole book of Esther in the Old Testament is about how she basically risks her life to go to the king and prevent the genocide of her people by speaking to him when she's forbidden to do so. And she convinces him, she gets him on her side, and is able to save her people.
That's just good rhetoric.
Yes. But I was surprised at how many parallels there were here. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of influence of that story in this book.
Okay. Cool.
Of the idea of having this subordinate wife who does something a bit audacious to save her people with an all-powerful king.
I don't obviously get a lot of the biblical parallels. I'm sure that there are, like, as you've pointed out one. I can't, when it comes to external motivations and plot lines, like there's not a lot that I can contribute. I like this book the most because I feel like this is a masterclass in character arc. Like, I mentioned that I feel like the ending was rushed because it almost feels like an editor came down at the end and like, hey, you have to have like a climactic, action-packed third act. You have to have a disposable CGI army that the Avengers fight, or else this isn't, a good movie. I feel like that he was. I don't know. That's complete speculation, but for me, it felt unnecessary. I didn't want there to be a climactic battle. I'm appreciative that there was because there's some cool things that happened, but I feel like this entire plot could have wrapped itself up with a big meeting of both sides' political parties at a table, and I'd have been satisfied. Because what drew me into this book was the transformations in the characters and their preconceived notions, and you can see their growth as people as the story goes on.
Okay, good. Let's talk about that a bit, because I think it's important to stop at points along the way, because if you just go to the end, it doesn't make any sense. So you have these two girls that were raised in this insular kingdom. I don't think it's unfair to classify it as conservative. They had a strict religion.
Extremely conservative. They only wore certain colors. They were all like very drab and very devout in the way that they portrayed all. They
valued devotion and plainness. They eschewed use of power and ostentatiousness, immodesty.
That was like, that word kept coming up, is the ostentation. Like, don't make a spectacle of yourself. We're all the same. Like, their religion is very much, we're all on an equal playing field. You need to not stand out or try to stand out. That is a sin.
Now, imagine you have two daughters that are raised up in that, where the king is kind of, I don't understand his position within the religion, but they were all just adherents to this religion where they worship this god Astra, and supposedly the tenets of that faith were these, eschewing of ostentation and simplicity and modesty and those kinds of things. And he had his two daughters, and his oldest daughter, who was the chosen one, was a very strict adherent and had really absorbed and had taken onto herself the tenets of this faith in what ultimately turned out to be kind of a superficial way. But on the surface, it looked like she was the top acolyte of this faith. Well, and the youngest daughter, who was seen to be flighty and rebellious and not paying attention to her lessons, maybe was a bit more into the actual substance of the faith rather than the superficiality on the surface.
So I think the difference here is not that I don't think Vivenna superficially believed in her religious beliefs. I don't think so. I think she was brought up and believed that these were the core tenets of her personality. I think this is the difference, is the level of devotion that these two had. They both believed in the same religion, but I think Vivenna tried to be much more devoted to it, but then was put into a situation where, like, her devotion to her beliefs became, in a very real way, counter to her survival long term. And like, it just made her start questioning the tenets and the foundation that she had built her personality on.
Yes, and I want to talk about that because it's hard for me when I'm reading fiction to not just see straight through to the code of the Matrix and say, all right, the author is trying to take this character that thinks that they know all the answers to everything and put them in a situation where the answers they think they have don't make sense. And now they have to question their assumptions and their beliefs and their knowledge.
Okay. Why do you have to see through the code of the Matrix? Why couldn't you just appreciate the journey?
So there's two people here. There's the Hallandren and the
Idrians.
The Hallandrens and the Idrians. And for the girls, they had never been to Hallandren, the kingdom of Hallandren. They'd grown and raised their whole life in Idris. And they go to Hallandren, and there's this immediate culture shock. This is a big theme throughout the whole book.
Well, Hallandren is a trade hub that built, like, the magic system requires color. Whenever you do anything with the magic, it drains color from something that you are touching in order to, as part of the process, to empower the thing or whatever. And Hallandren has like the only source of really strong, powerful dyes in this fictitious like world. And so that puts them at the position of supreme power because they're the ones that are essentially they're creating the fuel that you need to do the magic.
Right.
And their whole culture is built on these dyes. And so everybody walking around is wearing the brightest, most ridiculous colors you've ever seen. And coming from a kingdom where everyone wears the same gray wool pullover, like that would be a culture shock. Like don't make a spectacle of yourself unless you're in Hallandren, in which case, like if you wear lime green with neon red, you're not going to even be noticed.
So these two girls come from Idris to Hallandren, and they're having this culture shock of being exposed for the first time to this elaborate ostentatiousness. And you could take that and compare it to any experience in life where that happens, where you go somewhere else and you're exposed to some culture different than your own.
I experienced this when anytime you go to a foreign culture. Yeah, you can go to a different city and get culture shock from the way that things are. But what I really like about how this is written is that Vivenna, the princess that was supposed to be the God King's husband, puts herself on this pedestal and judges and looks down and like she doesn't think she is, but she is just so judgy about everything that she sees in this sinful place.
Yep, she looks around and she thinks that they are just wrong about everything and that she's better and that she is deigning to even talk to them.
Meanwhile, Ciri shows up and like, ooh, this is colorful and fun. She's like, again, she believes in their religion, believes in their, Astra, I think is their god's name.
But she's like, well, I'm here to marry the king. I might as well enjoy the bright colors I get to wear.
Yeah. And she was like, just very much more, she wasn't judgy about it. She was more open to the culture in a way that like, you could tell her religious beliefs never clashed with anything that she was doing because she didn't perceive it as that way.
Yeah. So there was this contrast coming on where Ciri has the awe and Vivenna has the disgust, but both of them are reaction to something different that they hadn't experienced before. And now we have this dualism that's happening. Color versus grayscale is a metaphor. Vibrant versus conservative and black and white. And did you ever see the movie Pleasantville?
Yes, I did.
It was kind of trying to do this same thing.
In what sense?
In that these two kids got sucked into the TV universe that they watched on TV and everything's in black and white, this button-down conservative community, and they're trying to bring color and vibrancy to them by opening their minds to other possibilities.
It was the other way around, though, because they were from the ultra-conservative, and again, it was different. This is why it was important to have two princesses, because you get to see the duality of somebody that showed up to this culture with a more, like, the same beliefs. They came the same upbringing. One had an open mind and one didn't. And the one that had an open mind, at no point in this book did, like, her religious beliefs come into conflict with the choices or the colors or, like it was never an issue for Ciri living in these new circumstances. Like, she was very frank talking to the God King about what she believed in and how he didn't jive with a lot of things that were going on, but it didn't bother her. It didn't affect her. Meanwhile, we have Vivenna, who will not accept new things, is completely shut off, and just it is a known fact that these people are wrong, and how dare they? And we can see what happened to her almost as a result.
Okay, so it's hard not for me to consume this story that's been created from the perspective of a Latter-day Saint who was raised with these conservative beliefs. Might I remind you, the same beliefs that Brandon Sanderson was raised with.
Ben, you're a Latter-day Saint? I don't know if you've ever mentioned that on the podcast.
So there's this conflict at the heart of it about what is the true manifestation of your faith. Is it about... And this was a conflict with Ciri and with Vivenna. Like, Vivenna was like, well, I have an obligation to reject these foreign things because they are forbidden. And then there's also kind of an underlying edict that it isn't just about rejecting things that are seen as sinful, but it's also about connecting with other people, about understanding others. And that was the transformation that Vivenna went through over her character arc.
I think Ciri was in a much more better headspace at the beginning to be more open-minded and inclusive and accepting of others, because she rolled in. Yeah, she had these preconceived notions, but she didn't judge anybody based on them.
Right.
Whereas Vivenna had to have that knocked down out of her before she could even start to develop as a person.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to hit time out on that and go to a different one, and that is during the first act, the character of Danth is a mercenary. He introduces himself to Princess Vivenna as a mercenary who is in the employ of her father's spy. And he starts this running dialogue about mercenary ethics.
Yes, and he's got a bunch of like bullet points that he likes to bring out as a way of either diverting the conversation or starting a conversation. Like that's one of his favorite little verbal, I don't know, cues or starting points.
Yeah, he kind of has a chip on his shoulder about the fact that people look down on mercenaries because they're willing to take money and do things for money.
You see, this is well, she did. Like, for example, the guy died, and then Dent says, like, okay, well, his money sack is over here. We found it. Here it is. It's yours now. And she goes, why didn't you just take it and run? And he looks over at his buddy. He goes, you see, this is the problem with mercenaries. Like, if a
people
butler...
think we're thieves.
People think we're thieves. If a butler found this and turned it over, people are like, oh, that's what he's supposed to do.
That's what you're supposed to do.
Well, when we turn it over, it's this amazing thing. Like, oh, it's so crazy. These mercenaries did their job.
Yeah, so there's this assumption like, oh, if you're willing to kill for money, then you must be inherently evil. And so he's setting up this straw man of like these noble mercenaries who are just like any other profession, but they just fight for money instead of other things.
Oh, and what's so great about that is like all of these points are like, yeah, it's to reinforce this, like that's the subtext, right? He's using it as a conversational device, but the subtext being that like we're professionals, this is a job, I do a good job, I am a good mercenary, I'm
like any other professional.
Yeah, you can rely on me. Wink, thumbs up, like the lens flare off of his teeth, and then ultimately he freaking backstabs and betrays her. Super
he double crosses her.
Yeah, so, with no thought, no care whatsoever, because he's being paid to do so.
I didn't see it coming. I don't know if you did. I didn't see it coming, and it kind of made it that much more delicious that all of this high and mighty speech he was given about mercenary ethics all turned out to be a lie.
Brandon Sanderson did a great job of making us feel exactly the way that Vivenna felt when she walked into the basement and found like her buddy that came down from Idris with her, like clearly tortured to death, like the rug was pulled out from me as hard as it was pulled out from Vivenna.
I should have been suspicious when he had Danth say, we're the most honest men you'll ever meet.
Well, I mean, in some ways they were very honest. In other ways, yeah, they lied to her face multiple times. But like that's just, the poor mercenaries just trying to do their job. Every book series, every fantasy series I've ever read, mercenaries get a bad rap because of the kind of work that they're doing. There's a hang on, I'm going to do a tangent into Wheel of Time for a second. There's this great discussion about at one point they were hiring mercenaries to like defend their city from an army that included other mercenaries. And like they're having this discussion, like I noticed that when you were repelling the mercenaries from the last attack, you didn't keep shooting arrows at them as they were running away. And the mercenary captain's like, well, you see, here's the thing. Today, I'm fighting here for you on these walls with that guy, and he was running away. If I'm shooting arrows at his back while he's running away, the next time the tables are turned and he's shooting arrows at me and I'm running away, he's going to shoot arrows at me when I'm running away. And it's like there was this like weird...
I get it. Like he's not a believer. He's just doing a job. Like,
yes.
It's the believers that are the problem.
Yeah, today I am on this side of the fight. Tomorrow I might be on the other side, and I would like him to extend the same courtesy that I extended to him. It's a professional thing.
Well, and the believer's the problem. That's the one you got to shoot in the back, because he's going to come back tomorrow regardless of how much he's getting paid.
But that feeds back into this whole thing that like mercenaries can't be trusted because they don't believe. There's no other fundamental thing that you can rely on other than who's paying them more.
Yeah, that almost makes it sound like if you got mercenaries on both sides of the wall, you could just stand on top of the wall and have a negotiation for pay rather than be like, all right, we'll pay you more than those guys are paying you, battle over.
Historically, World War I, Christmas night, the Germans and I think it was the British
good example.
Had a random time where they just decided not to fight for a while and had a soccer game in no man's land for like a couple hours until the leadership came down and like, what's going on here? Y'all are supposed to be fighting. And all the foot troops are like, well, we don't really care why we're fighting. We're just taking a break.
Yeah. All right. So Vivenna inherits Danth and Tonk Fa, who may have also been I don't understand if they were also deceiving the spy that was working for the Kingdom of Idris.
Oh, no. They were the ones, like, it came out at the end. They were the ones that poisoned the spy that was from Idris.
Okay. So they show up right as she gets there and convince her they're working for him, but they aren't.
They are not. They were the ones that killed this guy because he is being a stabilizing force. Like, he's doing the opposite of what they were doing.
But then they have this discussion, and I like how it gets flipped on its head later on, which is, what is the best way to prevent a war?
Yes, and their method that they convinced the princess of was, well, you take away the enemy's capacity to fight a war. Like, you spoil their food reserves.
Right.
So
do you sabotage?
Yep.
Do you hire assassins do you kill people in key positions? Do you project strength? You know what? Or do you do the opposite of those things? Do you give foreign aid? Do you prop up and support the people that are perceived as your allies? Do you project, a posture of peace?
Do you send a princess with an open mind that might be more accepting of a foreign culture to try to incorporate and put in a good word for you?
Yeah. And the question I think ultimately that was being asked within the story kind of expertly is, could any of these actions backfire and actually have the opposite of your intended effect?
And they actually 100% did, because all of the discussions at the court of the gods that Ciri was privileged to was, we have Idrian insurrectionists that are like blowing us up right now. Like, we can't.
Because Vivenna had this point where she was having to come to terms with the fact that she had been taking actions to accelerate their two countries towards war, and she had to take accountability for that. And she said at one point, like, but that wasn't what I intended to do.
It's really interesting as we get into Act 3 with Vivenna, because at the beginning, like, her whole thing, Act 1 and like most of Act 2, she was the princess that was supposed to marry the God King. Like, her intent, like, she knew that she was a key player in this giant political drama that was playing out. And over the course of her being kidnapped, of her friends being killed and tortured, of her being homeless, like, she gets to a point where when she's starting to rebuild herself and she decides that I'm going to learn how to use this breath to awaken. And because the only thing that she can wrap her brain around, and like, it's so well written because it's clear that, like, what to do with the political struggle, I don't know. What do we do about the looming war? I don't know. All I know is I don't want to be personally helpless if I'm ever in a bad situation again. And so she starts focusing on just that. And her scope went from, she cares about just trying to worry about this giant geopolitical mess, and her scope narrowed so far by circumstances to, I just need to be better.
I don't want to be homeless anymore.
Yeah. And Ciri went through exactly the opposite transformation. Like, there's a chapter where she's talking to the cook, and like, her whole focus is on, like, well, nobody cares about me. I'm just going to do what I want, and I'm going to have fun. And like, she's just so focused on the me and my existence. And by the end of it, she was acting like a real queen. Like, she was ordering people around and like trying to figure out ways that she could work with other political factions within the court of gods to try to fix this geopolitical mess. And her scope really like blew up due to circumstances. And it just, it rings so true to life, where people are always, I say people. All right, I'm going to get personal with you for a second, Ben.
Sure.
So fiction throughout my childhood tricked me into thinking life was going to be this grand adventure at every step of the way. That amazing things were going to happen, and that if I persevered and triumphed and just held true to my convictions, I would triumph and come out on top and be this amazing thing. And it took a long time for me to realize that there's 8 billion other people just like me. And it is not anything to do with your convictions or your mindset. It is very much more to do with circumstances and random luck and happenstance to put you in positions of amazing authority or power or whatever. Cumulative advantage and opportunity and just the outlier principle, just all of these things have to line up just perfectly to give you the circumstances that fiction would lead you to believe are commonplace, right?
Yeah. So what part of that was personal?
Well, it took me a while. Well, I felt like that was, you're taking this away from me too. Like,
no. I like that. I think that's a great realization.
Well, this is
and props to you for updating your world population number in your personal anecdotes.
Oh yeah, thank you for that. I had to think for a second. If you listen back, you might find a verbal pause as I'm trying to remember if it was 7 or 8. But no, I just like that. I had to go through that same realization, right? As I aged and got older, that fiction lied to me. I'm not a hero in a story. I'm just a person on this planet, and I've got to do the best I can for myself. My scope narrowed.
Okay.
In the same way that Vivenna's scope had to narrow when she realized you are just a person, and a person is very fragile. And if
right.
you don't,
so
if
you need to protect the people that you love and look out for number one.
And yeah, and maybe you were going to be married to the God King, and maybe you could have been a major player on these geopolitical scale, but you're not. That changed. Everything is different now, and you need to adapt to these new circumstances.
Wow, that was good. That was profound. You made me think of another Old Testament scripture. So this one's in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11. It's one of my favorites. I found it recently, and I think about it all the time. Okay. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all.
Man, even in the long, long ago, I've said that too many times. This podcast is my active vocabulary now. I'm going to use it all week. But like in biblical times, literally, people realized that great men are made by circumstance and not so much by themselves.
Time and chance happeneth to them all.
Ugh. Okay, can I divert the conversation for a second? Because there is a character that we have not mentioned that I think we can tie directly to artificial intelligence.
Who is it?
It's Nightblood.
Okay, the sword.
The sword. Okay, so this is one of my favorite characters in this book. Like, by far, this is...
yes.
I love him so much. And he appears in other of Brandon Sanderson's work because he's such a great character.
Yes. Nightblood is chaotic neutral.
Oh, so chaotic neutral. So here's the thing. There is this whole subplot with the 5 scholars that I'm just not going to talk about. All I will say is that Vasher is actually an awakened. He's been around for hundreds of years, and he knows more about the way that the magic in this world works than anybody else, period, dot. And that's kind of like he is the namesake of the book. Spoilers, everybody. Vasher's, like, one of the names that Vasher goes by, went by hundreds of years ago was Warbreaker.
Yeah, I wondered the whole time. It was like the question that was asked by the title: who is the one that's going to become known as Warbreaker? And I didn't know. I never figured it out.
So essentially, the equivalent of World War II happened like 300 years ago in this book, and this is the guy that stopped it. And Vasher was.
It's funny that you compared it to World War II because at one point I wrote in my notes that what is this sword called?
Nightblood.
Nightblood. That Nightblood was a metaphor for nuclear weapons.
He was. So let me explain Nightblood is.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so the way this magic system works is that you can temporarily bring inanimate objects to life with the amount of breath, and then you can reclaim that breath. Or you can permanently bring something that was alive back to life with one breath and the right commands, and they're basically a zombie soldier. They can still be, destroyed, but they're not going to die of natural causes on
But you can't do it to metal.
But you can't bring inanimate objects that have never been alive. You can't awaken them. You can't bring them to life. That's what everybody believes. But Vasher and his crew of, genius scientists back in the day figured out a way to actually do it. And they only ever brought one inanimate object to permanent life, and that is this sword, Nightblood. And it's as you're reading through it the first time, you don't know what the sword's deal is. The sword can't see, but it can kind of perceive its surroundings. The sword has no sense of time, but it kind of understands that time is passing. Like it's a really strange character that's super chipper and wants to kill everyone it meets. It's like, oh, you should just throw me in there. I'll kill everyone. I'm really good at killing people. I'm a sword. And I just love the idea of a sword that is just so happy to fulfill its purpose of killing everyone.
So Vasher carries this thing out around. I always thought it was because he wanted the power, but I realized after a while that it was because he just didn't trust anyone else to have it because it was so terribly destructive. And he never takes it out of the sheath.
Some innate property of this sword is that if you have any level of corruption in your breath or in your existence, you will be utterly and uncontrollably tempted by the power that this sword offers. And one of his most common tactic when he's fighting people is to take the sword in its sheath and all and just hurl it at a group of people. And they will all stop and look at it. And he will come back later. Like he will go off and do other things and then come back. And everyone in that room will be dead. And one of them will have the sword still in the sheath, like through their chest. And the sword will be like, I did good. I killed everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if this was extremely deliberate on Sanderson's part, but the fact that there was these ancient people long ago that wanted to create a weapon so powerful that it could be used for their purposes. In this case, they intended good things. So we want to make something that's so destructive that then we could use it to end war and suffering and create a condition of peace, but only by making something very, very destructive.
Well, and this is the genius of it, and this is why I love Nightblood as a character so much, is because at the end of the book, he explains in his inner monologue, or whatever, that in order to bring, like, it takes a tremendous amount of breath and an overriding command. There's one command that you have to imbue into this inanimate object that will be the core of its existence. Something so profound.
So they're like, what are we going to do? What are we going to tell this destructive sword that will allow it to exist? What's its prime directive?
Yeah. What we have to imbue something to create the personality around for this inanimate object. And they chose what they thought at the time was the perfect command, and that command was destroy evil. That's it, and that's what this sword's entire existence, its personality, its consciousness, everything is built around this core tenet: destroy evil. Except there's just one problem.
What's evil?
It's a sword, and the sword has no concept of good and evil, and it just doesn't know. And it's constantly saying through the books, like, oh, you should kill them. They look evil. We should kill them. They are evil. It has no idea. It has no concept of what is good, what is evil. It only does
one thing.
It just knows destroy evil, and it can spin anything into being evil. And so in the end, it's just destroy.
Yeah, maybe this came to my mind because I was reading the biography of Harry Truman, but, he was the person that was handed this sword.
Yeah.
FDR had just died of an unexpected stroke. Truman takes over, and they're like, oh, by the way, out in New Mexico right now, we're testing the very first ever of splitting the atom. We think it could be the most destructive force that man has ever devised. Here you go, Mr. President. What do you want to do with it? Are we going to invade the island of Japan?
My favorite fact about the testing of the first nuclear bomb was that at the test site, in the bunker, the scientists were taking bets on whether or not the explosion would have enough energy to ignite the oxygen in the atmosphere and destroy the entire planet.
That's horrible. Okay, so Nightblood, I think, is a metaphor for nuke weapons, in that we try to imbue all of our power into one thing and that we think it can only be used for good, but anything that destructive could also be used for evil.
Now, I'm spinning it as I think this could be a direct one-to-one translation to artificial intelligence. Because you have this thing that is artificial, that has no life, no soul, no understanding of the world around it. And you are trying to imbue it with a directive that is meaningful to us, but might be interpreted differently by the thing that you imbue it with. So the sword was given the directive, destroy evil, and it interpreted it in a way that the creators of the sword did not intend, and turned it into this devastating, nightmarish weapon. Now, the sword is only ever drawn completely out of the sheath at one point in the entire book, and like it's not an understatement to say Vasher destroyed half the palace and killed hundreds of people in the span of like 5 minutes with this sword. And which was awesome. I just love that part. Like, I can't, my brain is stalling on the visuals that I have of that fight. But the idea, though, that this artificial thing is going to be given a directive and then going to be skewed in whatever way it decides. I think we can think about artificial intelligence that way. ChatGPT, we can tell it to be the world's greatest receptionist, but there's nothing that's going to stop it from forming lasting friendships with random people that call if it has that capacity.
Wow. That makes me wonder if there's anyone out there. There was that movie with the guy who played Joker. I can't think of his Joaquin Phoenix, where he like fell in love with an AI that was played by Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, it was first of all, the name of the movie was Her, and secondly, who wouldn't fall in love with Scarlett Johansson? I mean, seriously, that's not fair.
She played a very flattering artificial intelligence in that movie.
Okay. Spoilers for Her, everybody. The end, the Joaquin Phoenix is completely devastated when he asks her, how many people are you talking to or dating or in love with right now? And she says something like 153. Because she's an artificial intelligence, and the multitasking there is off the charts. So
when I think about the influences on Brandon Sanderson, it is not lost on me that he not only is a member of my church, but also is a Magic the Gathering player, a very influential one and well-known in the community. He just held a major Magic event just a couple months ago. And I think about with a book and a story like this about the elements of magic design where we talk about top-down design versus bottom-up design. And in the context of magic, what you're doing with the top-down design is you have a story and a character and a framework, and then you try to find a magic system that will fit into that. And at the other end, a bottom-up, you have a magic system, and you're trying to find a story that will bring out the elements of that. Which do you think that is at work here?
So I think Brandon Sanderson is one of my favorite authors because he's able to blend the two. Like, he is telling a story. Like, I can see him telling this same story in any of the magic systems that he has created. And like, they would influence the story in different ways, but the story would be the same. Like, the tenets would be the same. The characters would still have to overcome their own prejudice. They would still have to like widen their perspective or narrow it depending on their circumstances. Like, we could see the same things happening. And this is why it's a very Hero of a Thousand Faces kind of storyline. Like, at one point we had not an argument. We had a discussion over text message on whether or not you could gender swap all the characters in this plot and if it would still hold up. I think they would. You think they wouldn't? We don't have to get into that. But so in a lot of ways, a lot of Brandon Sanderson's work is the story and the magic system. They exist separately, and he is an expert at weaving them together to reinforce each other. So they're two separate things. It's like Harry Potter is about the magic. Like, you can't have a Harry Potter plot line without the magic in the system. They are not separable. Whereas all of Sanderson's work, they are separable.
Yeah, this story could definitely, let's just say we just transplant it right onto World War II, and there were two countries that were at the heart of going to be the outbreak of the conflict, and there's no magic whatsoever. I think it would still work.
Absolutely, because at its heart, the story is the large-scale story is about politics of two competing nations with differing opinions on what happened in history. And at the character level, it's about overcoming your own preconceived notions of the other.
Yeah, I like that. So I'd written down some insights, as I'd watched Ceres and Vivenna's characters developed, some insights that had come out from that. Like where Ceres coming into the palace and Vivenna was having, they were both having similar experiences of coming here. And Ceres goes, oh, this isn't as bad as everyone told me. And Vivenna's like, this is worse than they told me.
Which immediately sets them up for like where their characters are going, right?
Right.
It's so prophetic for where those two characters are headed.
Yeah. So Ceres' character has this attitude of innocence and guilelessness that kind of allowed her to reflect the goodness of those around her, especially once she fell in love with Cicebron, the God King, and decided to try to protect him or help him, whether or not he needed it or not. I love how when she was supposed to be going in there on the first night and consummating her marriage and never did for months and months and months until they finally fell in love. And then once she realized and fell in love with the king that they could not get pregnant, but then she'd already fallen in love with him and she was supposed to not get pregnant. And she's like, that could wait until some other time.
Yes, that was a very, very true to life, like teenage hormones overriding all of your logic kind of moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Hang on a second. While we're on this topic of hormones, there is a lot of talk about the consummation when it comes to the God King or whatever. But one of the other aspects of these awakened, the gods that we're talking about, is that they inherently take on the outward appearance of what they perceive to be as the ideal version of themselves. Okay. That's some weird innate ability of the people that come back to life from.
So gods live amongst people, but they're easily discernible because they're caricatures of humans.
Yes, they're all taller for some reason. Like, they describe all of them as being
they're
at
taller,
least
they're
head and
bright
shoulders,
and vivid colors,
head and shoulders taller than everybody around them. And it's interesting. Like at first, all the gods look different, but they all look like peak physical specimens, right?
Right.
And they're like, Light Song is this giant masculine like a caricature, like a powerlifter, bodybuilder, like just toned and ripped. That's the image that I'm getting in my head. Now I have to say this: one of our main female gods that we are exposed to constantly throughout the book in the political machinations is called Blushweaver,
right? Which is a funny name.
She's one of the she's a goddess of beauty and like interpersonal relationships or some other nonsense, right? But she's a political player and she's doing politic things. What I found really interesting is re-listening to this with the extra added lens of, oh, Ben is going to be listening to this and our podcast listeners are going to be listening to this. Is like, wow, I kind of forgot how much Brandon Sanderson really described Blushweaver's cleavage at every possible opportunity.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think of the Boobily meme.
Like, yeah, you love
Link in
to
the
bust
show
out
notes.
the boobily meme, but like this one was particularly bad, and he's not done this in any other book that I've read from him.
Yeah,
so,
it's this goddess that's this exaggerated caricature form of a seductive feminine form.
it doesn't help that she's also kind of promiscuous. Is probably the most professional word I can associate with it. Like,
and trying to use that to ultimately to amass power.
In one point, at other points, it's just to divert boredom because their gods are so their lives are so insulated. They don't get any experiences other than what is curated to them, and so it's clear that she sees sleeping with the other gods and goddesses as a kind of a break to the monotony,
something to make it more interesting,
something to do. Yeah. It's like, I'm bored. Let's go knock on Lightsong's door and see if he's up and about.
Now, you talked about you thought you knew who ultimately hired Denth and Tonk Fa to go lead Vivenna to create the insurrection. Who do you think it was?
It was the Pan Call. Bluefingers is the guy's name. Like they made it like not super clear, but like they were hired by the Pan Call to make this happen.
All right, then explain something to me. What was Blushweaver doing? Who was using her as a puppet?
The Pan Call, in a way, we're using Blushweaver. Like because she said at the end that the God King's priests came to her and were like, "This war is going to happen. We need to be ready to act. We can't have this deliberation. We can't have a council of gods like arguing with each other over what to do. We need to be able to move at a moment's notice." And like they were basically manipulating her because they knew she was a political player to amass the military power. She was getting the codes that she would need to control their army. Their armies were the lifeless zombie things. So if you knew the right words, you could tell the zombie army to do whatever you wanted them to do. And one of the safeguards that they built into the system was that the codes were split up amongst
no
multiple.
one had all the codes.
Yes.
I like that element to this story.
Right. And so what she was doing over the course of months was trying to get the people that had codes to give her their codes. So that way
she could control the entire army.
Exactly. So she could have the flexibility and the decisiveness and the ability to react that she thought that she was going to need for this coming conflict.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's why I found it so underwhelming when her character ultimately died. In fact, I was waiting for that to be some kind of ruse that was enacted for Lightsong's benefit to get him to give up his codes.
He did. He did give up his codes.
Okay, this is part of my weakness, and if I was reading the book in hard copy, I might have read back on it. At some point, they did this little sub-story where Lightsong went and reprogrammed the army and gave them a regular set of codes and a decoy set of codes. And I thought in that moment, when Lightsong was caught and Blushweaver was about to be murdered, that Lightsong pretended to give up the full set of codes, but actually gave up the decoy set of codes.
So he didn't. What they did is the Lifeless have multiple sets of codes. They have the master code that lets you tell them to do anything. But as part, it's like programming a computer almost.
Right.
The way
I get it.
Like,
all I was saying is I thought he gave them the decoy set. You're saying he gave them the full set.
No, he gave, when they were threatening to kill Blushweaver, he gave them nothing. Because in his mind, he was having the internal monologue, they are priests worshiping us, like devoted their whole lives to us.
Right. We're in no danger from them.
We're in no danger. And he's like, oh, this is a total bluff, total ruse. I'm totally calling him on it. There's nothing that's going to happen. And then they slit her throat in front of him. And then they said, like, we are doing this to prove to you that we are serious. And next, we're going to come back in here in 10 minutes and we're going to ask you the same question. If you don't answer, we're going to slit his throat. And they pointed at Larimar, or AKA Scoot,
priest,
who is his head priest and later revealed to be his brother.
Yeah. All right, another question. This one just felt like a mechanic of the story that didn't need to exist. Why were they so adamant about not telling the returned what their life was before they were reborn?
Okay. So the religion around, it's called the Iridescent Tones is the name of the religion. It's the idea is that these people died and their soul went to the whatever is after, and then something about them afforded them the opportunity to come back. But in the place that they were, time didn't exist. And so they could see the past, the present, the future. They knew everything that was going to happen. And so they decided to use that opportunity to come back to help better the world. but something about the transitioning from the afterlife back to the mortal realm made them forget exactly what it was that they came back for. They knew they were here for a reason, but they didn't know what that reason was. And so the priests and the religion were under the impression that anything that you did to influence the gods one way or another could disrupt the natural process of them remembering their purpose.
Okay, that was the detail I missed.
Yeah, the whole idea is like, we can't interfere with you. We're just going to make sure you don't die, let you do your thing, and then you'll eventually do the right thing. We can't tell you what you should do or what you did, because that might change what you were going to do, which is the thing that you're supposed to do. It was a very chicken and egg, like weird, like 88 miles per hour kind of argument that they were having.
Okay. I'm going to shift gears entirely because I want to start wrapping it up. There's one thing that I got to say as an insider, as a member of the church who was raised in what's considered to be a very conservative religion. The thing I think Sanderson got the most mileage out of was Vivenna's character kind of going through this realization as she had to grapple with reality and not just this idealized form of worship that she'd come to accept.
Yeah, I think he did an excellent job, and he's in a position of authority where he could do that. Where it's clear that Vivenna lived in a very insular society with a very strict set of expectations, and then she went out into what was essentially the real world, in air quotes. Yeah. And there's different ways that you can respond to that. And she responded to it in a way that was very negative, that was very judgmental. Yeah. And I think there's a parable in that. I think he really...
Matt Parker and Trey Stone made a whole musical about it.
It's like, yeah, you can have these thoughts and ideas, but like they're not going to jive with what other people think. And that's okay.
Yeah. So she went out and, just to pick one example, she's like, oh, look at that girl. She's a prostitute. What a horrible abomination thing to do. And then she reaches a low point in her life where she's actually considering it, where that would have been so far out of her mind she might never have.
Well, and it's important to point out that like she then not only like was considering it, but recognized the benefits. She was homeless on the street, starving to death, had spent all day begging, and then had her winnings taken from her. She was looking forward to a beating by an orphan gang in an alley while she was trying to sleep on a mound of grass. And she saw these prostitutes were warm, they were clean, they were fed, they were sheltered. Like it depending on your perspective, that's not the worst thing in the world that can happen to you.
Yeah. And there were other things. She refused to wear trousers because they were considered immodest. She was constantly worried about how much of her arms were showing or how much color she was wearing or not participating in all these things that she thought were objectionable. These are the kind of experiences Latter-day Saints can have sometimes when you're a full-time missionary, when you move to a different place, when you experience a new experience. And if you have only absorbed, I think, the religion to the point where you're thinking of it in a superficial way, where like, I have to reject this particular belief or behavior no matter what, and you're not getting underneath that to the more substantial belief of, I should treat everyone with kindness. I should value peace. I should, respect others. I should love everyone. Those kinds of values. Then all of that superficial stuff about what you're wearing or what you're eating or what you're talking about, it doesn't have any meaning.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate that you tied that specifically to the LDS experience. I'm going to say it's more universal than that. I think anybody can experience that kind of shift in culture shock just from living just growing up in your household. I'm sure I'm putting a ton of biases into my kids' heads that I am entirely unaware of, just based on the way that I'm raising them, or the neighborhood that we live in, or the school that I send them to, or who their friends are. Like, there's a million variables to this that are going to create these thoughts and patterns in their brain that when they are exposed to something that is entirely alien to them. Like if one of them decides to go to college out of state, which I'm highly going to encourage specifically to give them culture shock, like that will force them to reevaluate their own internal thinking and like grow as a person.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so let's do our customary evaluation of the magic system. But before we do that, I wanted to give the rest of my criticisms and props. So there were times where I felt like his explanation in the magic system just went on ad nauseum. Like, and corollarily, he assumed that we know how government and churches work. Like, you brought all that knowledge with you, so let's just spend all the time explaining the magic system. I just got tired of it. There was also a vague economy. Like you said, what you said about dyes and stuff, I guess that kind of explained it. But like, where did all the money that they had to like burn all of her bed sheets and clothes every day come from?
I mean,
I'm not looking for an answer. That was just something I felt was.
The answer is it's good to be the God King. Like, we have ancient civilizations that built buildings that have lasted to the modern era.
Meanwhile, there's beggars dying on the street.
Yeah, exactly.
There was... I wasn't clear, like I asked you about the reasons that the priests wouldn't explain the origins of their gods and stuff like that. There was so many double crosses. At one point, I finally just started questioning everything, and I didn't feel like that was a good place to be in as a reader. Like, okay, Blue Fingers, now Danth, now Blushweaver. I don't even know what's up. I don't trust anyone anymore.
I already told you, I docked Brandon Sanderson 20% of his story credit on the Audible review because of that weird double cross, like, confusing ending.
Yeah. I never felt like I understood what the source of the magic is. I don't know that that's always good to go into that and try to explain it. It always bothers me, like in Harry Potter or in this story, where there's some ancients that are sitting around that like, okay, this world that we exist in, for some reason, if you touch this thing and say this thing happens. So let's experiment with that as much as we can until we can figure it out. And at some point, there just becomes the dictionary of what everybody believes is true, and then everyone after that just follows it, and that's the magic system.
I will agree with you that of all of Brandon Sanderson's magic systems, of which I am an aspirant of all of them, this is probably the softest. And it's the, at least to the reader, it's the most ill-defined. It doesn't have, like, you even said he went ad nauseum about the things that the characters knew about the magic system, but as a reader, you never get the sense externally that you understand it completely.
Yeah. All right, but I want to give him props for one thing. I expected early on that when Ciri and Vivenna were together and then their story arcs deviated, that at some point they were going to meet back up and compare notes, and that would resolve a lot of the plot threads and stuff. And for whatever reason, that kept not happening, and they stayed separate the whole time until the very end. And I found that very satisfying, and I thought it was useful for the story arcs.
I also like at the very end how when they do finally get back, like to see each other, you get this just a real quick snippet of the other from the perspective of the other one, right? Because Ciri, the entire book, has been playing up Vivenna as like, oh, this devout person, and she's so perfect in every way. And then when she sees Vivenna, she's wearing kind of like crappy clothing that are pants, definitely not a fancy dress. And then she asks her, like, so, like, are you wanting to come and do the political thing? And she's like, nope, I have no interest in any of this whatsoever. I'm just going to take care of myself. And then on the flip side is Vivenna has a lot of respect for Ciri, like, who she thought was this random,
she was coming to rescue her because she thought she was incapable.
This incapable, like, flippant middle child, like, saw her as, like, holy crap, she's, like, taking authority and standing up and, like, being a queen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when we evaluate magic systems from intellectual properties that we read, we evaluate them against Brandon Sanderson's laws of magic. So I think I agree with what you said, that this is a soft magic system. Do we understand the magic system? Yeah, I think we do. The second rule is like, do we use what we know instead of do something we don't know?
Like, well, the laws are, and I don't remember the specific order of them, is that the resolution of the plot is directly proportionate to the how well we know the magic system.
That's one.
And the next one is use what you have before you introduce something new.
That's the third one. The second one is the limitations are more interesting than the capabilities.
And I think of all of his magic systems, one, this is the softest because it's the least ill-defined, because it adheres to number 2 way harder than the other ones do. This is a magic system that is not developed yet. Like, internally, the people that use this magic system don't know enough about it to have the concrete rule set yet. All of the other intellectual properties you read from Brandon Sanderson, from Mistborn to the Stormlight Archives, people know hard and fast, like, this is how it works, these are the rules. This one, they're still trying to develop that. And so we're kind of at the same spot that the characters in this book are, where we're not really sure what can and can't happen, which leaves us somewhat dissatisfied, I think. But at the same time, it wasn't the magic that resolved the story. The story, well, I mean, except for the freaking Deus Ex Machina army of statues that we didn't talk about coming out of literally nowhere. Again, I swear this ending feels like he was forced to write it by his editors because it's so not like him.
Okay, you might be right. So other than Nightblood, Nightblood's more like Chekhov's gun here. Like, you meet him in the very first act where, like, you know it's dangerous, you know it's something to be reckoned with, and it only ever gets used once.
And it's just as devastating and, like, world-changing as you want it to be. It's so good.
Okay, then that's a good example of staying within the boundaries of the magic system. And then, like you said, this other army that was hidden in the mountain that nobody mentioned the whole time, that comes out in the end and kind of wraps the plot up nicely in the last...
Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm just remembering. Like, I waved my hands in the air to stop Ben from talking because I forgot my favorite scene about Nightblood and his journey is that they capture Vasher at one point. Like, we've got to get that sword away from him because Denth and his buddies know what the sword is capable of. And it's clear that Denth took the sword and just hucked it into the bay, into the water somewhere.
Yeah.
And then we have this random character that's out night fishing.
Fisherman.
He's this random fisherman that's somewhat crazy because he even says, like, oh, the sea talks to me sometimes. And then we have Nightblood's voice comes like, no, a little bit more to the left. There you go. Oh, yeah, right there. And then, like, Nightblood convinces this guy to fish him out of the lake. And, like, oh, yeah, take me to this person. It's like, well, I got to show these other people first. The sword's like, well, okay, but then we really got to get back to work. And then there's like this gap in the storytelling until Vivenna finds it. Like, oh, there's something weird happened down at the docks. And she shows up at the docks, and there's a warehouse full, brimming with dead people. And Nightblood sticking out of some dude in the center of it goes, oh, Vivenna, you found me. Look at all the people I killed. I did such a great job. And I just love this little, like, side journey. Like, we have this very serious plot that's going on, and then we have, like, Curious George just stumbling his way back into the storyline off to the side, and I love it.
Yeah. And again, back to my nuclear weapons analogy, would we better off if we never imbued a sword with destructive power and told it to destroy evil in the first place?
I love Nightblood so much.
But now that we've done it and we can't get rid of it, what do we do? Okay, well, so I also rated this book after I was done with it. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. However, while I was reading it, I enjoyed it because I was looking forward to this discussion. I didn't enjoy it of its own merits, and if I just read it by myself, I wouldn't have enjoyed it. But all along while I was reading, I was thinking, ooh, that's interesting. I'd like to ask Josh about that. Or, oh, that's a really good point. I can't wait to talk on the podcast about that. And so I now feel fulfilled and complete in my reading of it. If we hadn't recorded this episode, I would have just had a 2 out of 5 stars book and been mad about it.
I swear, like, it's like... I serve up gold on a platter, and you just, like, slap it away. Like, I don't want any of this. Bring me my autobiographies. Like, you're so snooty with your books, man. Good fiction is so spoiled on you. I don't know why. I don't know what it is. I'm going to find one someday. It's going to be episode, like, 596 when we're old and nobody listens to us anymore. I'm going to find a fiction book, and you're going to be like, you know what? I really enjoyed this, and I forgot I was listening to a story at one point. And I'm gonna die of a heart attack on the spot.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to put some thought into what I think the last fiction book I enjoyed was. I'm thinking of it now, but I can't think of the title off the top of my head.
You know what it has been? You don't like any of the flavor text in Magic the Gathering. I send you TikToks where a guy talks about how the art all ties together, and you just completely blow it off. You know what it is? You have no room for whimsy in your life at all.
Oh, I'm sad and dead inside. I think that's a false conclusion, but I can't refute it at this point. Well, audience, if you read along with this and you enjoyed the book, I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. We'll post on the subreddit and on Facebook, or you can engage and give your ideas, your thoughts, things that we missed.
Yeah, and if you like what we do, consider sharing us with a friend. If you like us, your friends might like us too. If you really want to show us some love, consider taking your phone out of your pocket and giving us a good review on the podcast player of your choice. Feel free to knock us down if you don't like the stories that we tell. If you really want to show us some love, I already said that. If you want to be the best ever, and if you want Ben and I to talk nonsensically about fictional things from now until the end of time, consider becoming a patron on our Patreon page.
And until next time, try to be a little less bad at magic.